The royal palace issued an order to the southern defense line, asking them to help Roman and stall for time until the main Cairo forces arrived in the south. The commander on the walls of the fortress went to his soldier and called him. He answered so exactly. We are presented with a man with long hair and a blue cloak. This is the commander of the third line of defense, Baron Vasily. And he says tensely that if Hector's army was defeated by an army that did not have even 200 soldiers, then Hector's armed forces are weaker than they expected. The adjutant answered. Vasily turned around and looked down under the fortress walls. The adjutant slowly walked towards him and said that he also thinks so. Moreover, there is a rumor that the kingdom of Hector has been suffering from a prolonged famine in recent years and is about to fall. They only take money, but in fact nothing special. Vasily furrowed his brows and thought that for 3 years now he has been rotting on this outskirts. Perhaps this is his chance sent by heaven. His aura turned yellow, and he continued to think that to help Roman and stall for time, if the boy could take command, then so could he. Vasily shouted to dictation to summon the army right away. He was using guerrilla tactics to teach the Hector kingdom a lesson. Hector, if you look at the map, had access to all the defense lines in order to deal with the defensive fortresses as quickly as possible. Hector's army divided the military forces and attacked. Among them, the army aimed at the third line in total was 3,000 people. Vasily's warriors easily crushed and killed Hector's warriors, and Baron Vasily went into hiding and attacked them surreptitiously. But contrary to his expectations, they were not met by a scattered rabble ready to fall from a single blow. Vasily looked at Hector's army in dismay, and then said that it was simply impossible. Hector's soldiers were cold-blooded in their anger, and the soldiers of the southern front, exhausted with comfort, could not resist them. One of Hector's knights leaped furiously at Vasily, swinging his sword. Victory in the mountains could only be achieved thanks to Roman Dimitri, and Cairo's commanders didn't need much time. To realize this, Vasily looked at the approaching death in fear, and then passed out. Hector's warrior easily cut Basil in half. An aide-de-camp arrived at King Daniel and knelt down in front of him, shouting that it was known that the commander of the third line of defense, Baron Vasily, had died during a battle with the enemy. Suddenly, the adjutant turned around, saw someone else, and one of the soldiers ran into King Daniel's office and shouted that the third and fourth lines of defense were under enemy attack. The magic message shone, and someone shouted that a message had arrived from the second line of defense. The knight desperately looked at the king. His armor was covered in blood. Then he said that at this rate they would not last 10 days, and begged to be saved. King Daniel looked at the soldier in fright, then asked with a tremor in his throat that the entire defense line had fallen in just a day. King Daniel became desperate and thought that just because Cairo's warriors were strong, it didn't mean that Hector's warriors would be weak. It suddenly dawned on Daniel that it was possible that a person named Roman had led the kingdom to a stunning victory. Daniel clenched his fist and then thought that he was careless. He asked where Roman Dimitri is now. A dark cave appears in front of us, from which steam escapes. Roman reflected that there are still many things in this world that he does not know. First of all, magic. If Moram cultivated combat power based on using the energy of nature, then this world created a new area called magic. Roman was sitting on the floor, surrounded by a dark aura, meditating and thinking that if Edwin Hector had been a more outstanding magician, he wouldn't have been able to escape from there. He still hadn't managed to reach the level of magic power that he possessed as a sky demon Beak Juna, and a hasty decision can drive him to the edge of a cliff. Edwin Hector is like a spider, and Roman is a butterfly. He predicted Roman's attack and waited, spreading his spider web. Romana thought uneasily. At the beginning, a powerful pillar of inferno flame. He needs to think again. If he had taken the damage back then and attacked Edwin with lightning bolt, he would have used this spell and swung his sword with great force at Edwin from above. Then he would have hit Edwin with great force. But then Butler would have protected Edwin with his sword. There is no way Butler would have let him do it, and he would have repelled his attack. His current strength isn't enough to defeat the alliance of a mage and a 5-star swordsman. At that moment, Butler threw Roman a couple of meters away from Edwin. But perhaps this was what he was waiting for. A victory for which he would have to put his life on the horse. Roman swung his sword, a new challenge. Roman with a jump hit Butler's sword, a new strong opponent. So Roman's head flew off his shoulders. Roman is not able to live a comfortable life. He replayed the battle with Butler in his mind again and again. And in the end, he managed to defeat Edwin by stabbing him in the stomach with his sword. Roman watched Edwin's lifeless body fall to the ground. There was blood on Roman's face, and he looked at the dead Edwin with displeasure and thought that the preparations were complete. We are taken to Henry, who screams frantically at Chris and then asks that Mr. Roman didn't tell him when he was coming out. Henry, standing in front of Chris, shouts in frustration that he doesn't know what Roman is doing right now, but the royal palace is desperately looking for Mr. Roman. Let Chris help him meet him. Chris Sarova replies that until the novel is released, no one can disturb him. Henry is startled and asks why such extremes. What is Roman doing there alone? Suddenly, Henry saw a silhouette coming out of the cave. Looking at Roman's blood-stained armor, he asked what was wrong with his appearance. We are taken to the tent. Chris, Henry, and Roman stand next to a table with a map on it. Then Chris reports that, as Roman expected, the third and fourth lines of defense were destroyed in just one day, and the second line is also very inferior to the enemy in terms of level. They all looked at the map together, which showed the points of the defense line and the enemy's rear. Chris went on to say that yesterday Hector gathered all the battle supplies and settled in the fortress in the rear, most likely. They are preparing for a life and death battle. All of a sudden, Henry turned to Roman and said that the entire Cairo royal palace was on alert right now, and they were looking forward to Roman getting in touch. Henry looked at Roman with a puzzled and indignant expression, then said that they had done everything they could. Why not entrust the rest to Cairo's main force? Roman had blood on his face, then calmly said to be tied up with the king. We are taken to King Daniel, who is sitting in front of a magical message that shows Roman with a stern look. King Daniel says with a frown that the news has reached him that all the defensive fortresses of the southern front have fallen, which is what Roman has been doing all this time. Roman calmly replied that he had been reorganizing the battle force for a week, and King Daniel was puzzled when he asked about the reorganization. King Daniel was tense in his conversation with Roman. He said that Roman had made outstanding achievements and he didn't want to condemn Roman's decision. But during this time, the entire southern defense line had fallen to the enemy. And then King Daniel Sarova asked if Roman could give them a little help. Roman calmly replied that he would be honest, but in the battle with Hector, he was lucky. Roman then furrowed his brows and said that if it was a battle on a plain that didn't have the advantages of a mountainous area, even he wouldn't have a way to help them. In this war, Hector put his life on the line. Battler joined the battle second in the ranking of the kingdom of Hector, and the enemy commander-in-chief Prince Edwin Hector confirmed that he was actually a magician. King Daniel shouted in fright that the 5-star swordsman was a battler and a mage. Roman, looking at the king, calmly replied that as everyone knows, the full potential of a magician is revealed on the plain. High-ranking officials were standing around the magic message, and Roman went on to say that he was thinking about how to fight when Cairo's main troops arrive. The Marquis, frowning, looked away and thought that Roman had made the right decision. Now the southern front does not have the strength necessary to win. Denver closed his eyes and thought. Just to think, Butler himself. Grigory, worried, thought that the kingdom of Hector really put everything on the line. Suddenly, the Marquis returned to King Daniel, and then said that Your Majesty, he no longer sees the point of interrogating the war hero. Denver agreed with the Marquis. King Daniel covered his face with his hand and said that he wouldn't continue asking questions, then added that Roman would soon have the main battle power of Cairo. King Daniel leaned down and removed his hand from his face, then added that Hector was already established in the rear fortress. As soon as the main army finished all the proper preparations and attacked, let Roman join them and be there. Romano looked down and then realized that even if Hector had broken off his agreement with Cairo, he hadn't given up on continuing the war. What is the best choice the enemy can make, and what is the worst for them? Roman looked up at King Daniel and then apologized and said that time was not on their side. The king of Daniel now looked at Roman and asked him what he meant by that. Roman replied that they only had a maximum of 3 days after the main troops arrived. If they couldn't destroy the rear fortress in that time, Hector definitely would. He confuses an external force, like the Kronos Empire, into this. When King Daniel heard this, he was very scared, and then with a trembling voice, he asked, then what should they do? Roman smiled and said there was only one way. He enthusiastically said, attack head-on, destroy Hector's army before that happens. We are taken to a magical message that shows the silhouette of Count Hadad from the Kronos Empire, a guy dressed in rich clothes, with a small stubble on his chin. He smiles contentedly, and then says that crossing the south of Cairo and the gate is quite a tempting offer. However, it will be difficult to accept the terms of the Hector kingdom right now. Hadad throws up his hands, and then Echidna, smiling, says that getting the southern front, of course, is not bad, but what is the reason for them to suffer the wrath of Cairo on their own skin? Edwin seethes with anger, but continues to listen in silence to Hadad's words that if Hector holds out in the rear for the next month and does not let the fortress collapse, then they will agree to a deal with Hector. Edwin, looking at the Echidna smiling Hadad, thinks that even in this situation, he intends to benefit. Hadad asks what Edwin thinks about this. Edwin purses his lips and thinks it's unfortunate, but they have no other choice, and then says they accept the offer. Edwin turns to Jackson and tells him to contact the Hector royal family immediately. And then they calmly add that they need to deliver people and ammunition through the teleportation gate, which should be enough to last a month, and Jackson answers with a tilt of his head that he obeys. Magic teleporters that glow with blue energy. It will take at least 3 days to establish a connection with Hector's teleportation gate. Edwin will think that if he manages to hold out all this time, then I won't be able to survive. He would go back to Hector and give him hope. We are taken to a squad led by a general, who looks at the castle that recently belonged to Cairo, and then says that how dare they plant their flag on Cairo's territory. We are introduced to the commander of the main force, Count Fabius, from the aristocrat faction, who is dressed in a knight's uniform with a red cloak, is a middle-aged man with a small mustache under his nose, and blue hair. He is displeased, saying that Hector should be cursed. Then we are taken to a tent located in the middle of the forest. In it sits a man with a thick mustache under his nose and a green cape. This is the leader of the main forces of Baron Taylors of the Kronos Empire faction. Across from him sits an unfriendly-looking man with a long nose, disheveled hairdo, and a red cloak. This is the leader of the main forces, Baron Brahim from the Valhalla Empire faction. All 3 commanders sit across from each other and are silent, and in the middle of the table is a map. Fabius thought with a frown that the important central government officials had come here personally, which proved how necessary it was to enlist Roman Dimitri's support. Then someone announces that Mr. Roman Dimitri has arrived. Roman slowly enters the tent, his armor showing numerous abrasions. Fabius studies Roman with his eyes and then says, "Welcome. It's an honor to meet the hero Cairo in person." Roman is a hard-faced man. His face is covered with abrasions, and the commanders say that Roman is much more noble than the rumors say about him. We are transported to Fabius' memories. He stands in front of the Marquis. The Marquis frowns and says that he doesn't care what happens to the southern front, and Fabius' primary task is to ingratiate himself with Roman Dimitri. The Marquis raises his hand in satisfaction and says that if you lose the war with Hector, the responsibility can be shifted to the shoulders of the royal family. But if Roman is taken away by another faction, this can upset the balance of power. Fabius looks at Roman and thinks that the eldest son of the family, Dimitri, known for his influence throughout the northeast, Roman Dimitri, although he is concerned about the fact that the family comes from commoners. But Roman is barely over 20. Fabius stretches out his hand to a chair and says, "Have a seat." Roman replies, "Thank you." Then Fabius thinks that if he could win such a talent over to his side, the Marquis would trust him with more serious matters. Fabius puts his hand on his chest and says that he is Fabius, serving Marquis Benedict, and he heard that the Marquis personally connected Roman to the southern barracks. Then Fabius closes his eyes and smiles, and says that the Marquis asked me to tell you that even though he did it with the best of intentions in the direction of Roman, he feels guilty that everything turned out this way. Roman, sitting down at the chair, replies that everything is fine. No one could have predicted this. Fabius laughs and says that Roman is right. Fabius continues to communicate with Roman, saying that after all, Roman will not give him a moment alone. The Marquis has prepared a special gift for Roman, and Thalers is watching the whole conversation with displeasure. And then Thalers grumbles that Count Gregory is also waiting for Roman to contact him, saying that he has extremely useful information for Roman. Brahim interrupts Thalers and says that the Count of Denver sent soldiers from the family's personal possession. Let the novel find the right use for them. Thalers is dissatisfied and continues to say that they're family. Hearing all this, Roman raises his voice in displeasure and says, "What the hell are you doing right now?" Thalers looks at Roman in fright and asks in a whisper what. Roman, frowning, replies that he is not so naive as not to understand why the commanders were looking for a meeting with him. However, right now, with the enemy marking their territory under their noses with their flag while holding their head high, he doesn't think it's right to discuss Roman's position in the current situation. After Hector is crushed, he will challenge the rankers' competition to become the strongest swordsman of Cairo. Roman then calmly answers in a lower tone of voice that until then, let them be patient. Roman will prove his worth and dedicate his sword to one person. The commanders, looking at Roman puzzled, thought the strongest swordsman is Cairo. Roman, looking at the puzzled commanders, calmly continued that so why don't they continue, focusing on the current situation. The situation was settled by Roman's suggestion, and a full-fledged meeting began. In the end, it was a battle over who had destroyed the castle, and opinions were very different about this, but there was no clear decision. The lamp was shining brightly in the corner of the room. Roman said that to use the teleportation gate connection, Hector needs to buy at least 3 days. Most likely they will delay, immediately reacting to their attacks. Fabius held out his hand, then turned to Roman and said that in that case, there were no more than 10,000 soldiers left of Hector's military force. They had brought 20,000 soldiers, but they didn't have enough advantage to win even in a head-on clash. Roman, looking at Fabius, calmly replied that although they outnumber Hector thanks to the support of the main forces, but as long as the mage Edwin Hector exists, he can't claim that the advantages are on their side. Nevertheless, Romana smiled, then said that it didn't mean there was no way at all. The soldiers were running around the fortress shouting that the enemy was coming and they should immediately form a line. We are being transported to the main body of the Cairo kingdom. Thousands of soldiers lined up under the Cairo banner. At the head is Commander Fabius, who calmly looks towards the fortress. Then someone stepped forward, toward the fortress. It was Roman, he shouted. Hector's soldiers, listen, he's Roman Dimitri. Roman pointed his sword towards the fortress and shouted that he, as a warrior representing the Cairo kingdom, was challenging Butler of the Hector kingdom to a duel. Edwin, watching Roman's army from the battlements, was startled to wonder what Roman was doing, what he was up to again. Roman, raising his sword, furiously shouts that he doesn't want any more pointless sacrifices, and so does Hector. Roman looks unfriendly in the direction of the fortress, and then adds with a shout that if suddenly Hector wins this battle, Cairo will humbly accept Hector's offer. If on the contrary, Roman wins, Hector will leave Cairo's territory. Edwin looks down in fright, and then thinks that with Roman's current strength, he can't beat Butler, but he still insists on fighting. This is some kind of trap. The crystal in Roman's sword shines, and Roman keeps shouting what if Hector doesn't accept his offer. Roman pointed his sword towards the fortress, and then shouted that he would crush the rear fortress even if he had to lose his life. He gives Hector 10 minutes. He hopes that during this time, Hector will make a wise decision. Edwin looks at Roman, startled, and then wonders if this is a dilemma. Butler appears in front of Edwin and confidently says that he will fight. Edwin sitting on the throne saying that this is out of the question. Butler confidently replies, asking Edwin to believe in not Horus just once. He will cut Roman's throat and find a way for Hector to escape. Edwin furiously shouts that it's not that he doesn't trust Butler, but in just one night, they lost 700 men hoping to provoke Roman. Butler bowed his head to Edwin as Edwin continued to shout about the smell of burnt soldiers' flesh still lingering in his nostrils. Edwin fell into despair and then shouted that he believed in Butler, but Roman Dimitri was definitely up to something. Butler replied with a frown that Roman, whatever he prepared, he was sure that he could beat him to smithereens. Butler thought of his younger self and then said that he had devoted his entire life to serving Edwin, and that in his eyes Butler looked like a coward who could not accept the challenge for fear of falling into a trap. Edwin paused and then completely drooped and lowered his head, and then in a whisper suddenly told Butler to promise only one thing. Edwin said he didn't want to lose him, which made Butler's throat tighten, and he went on to say that if Butler felt even a hint of oddity, he should run right away. But Butler said he was listening. He confidently walked out of the throne room, then said that he would be back soon then. We are transported to the city gates. Butler came to a duel with Roman. He said that in his entire life he met many psychos, but such as Roman for the first time. Butler started to give off a yellow aura, and added that he didn't know what kind of trap Roman had prepared, but he would do his best. Roman approached Butler, who was wearing a strong aura, and then said that at the very moment when they clashed with swords in the mountain, he wanted to see what the outcome of their battle would be. There was no trap. His hopes were only for a demonstration of his true abilities. Roman smiled like a lunatic, and then said that let them bring their best efforts. Butler killing him here would get him what he wanted. Butler smiled at Roman, then said he was a crazy. Roman and Butler locked their swords in a duel, the loud sound of iron resounding through the entire area. We are shown a guy with an axe in his hands. Turquoise strong energy emanates from him, the level of 5 stars, reaching it. You can prove your strength to the whole continent. The strength of just one person is enough to change the course of the battlefield. Butler drove the aura through his body at an insane speed. Since the honor of Hector's kingdom was at stake, he didn't plan on dragging out the fight for long from the beginning. Roman and Butler clashed their swords in a fierce battle. Butler, swinging with great force for a blow, thought that he would end the novel right now with one blow. It was very difficult for Roman to hold back Butler's punch. He used all his strength. Butler and Roman were so strong that the ground beneath them began to crack. Edwin and his fighter were watching, their mouths hanging open in horror as the battle unfolded. Fabius and Thalers were also watching these monsters in fright. Butler's sword flew straight towards Roman. Butler lunged forward at high speed to pierce through Roman, but in the last seconds, Roman managed to jump over Butler. Suddenly, Roman felt something. Before he could land, Butler was already behind him, swinging his sword with great force, and then violently hitting Roman. But Roman managed to parry the blow by blocking with his sword. A huge flash occurred together with the blows. Butler's sword sank into the ground. The speed was so great that an unprecedented amount of energy split the earth in two. Fabius, watching their battle, was startled to think that in order to curry favor with Roman, he had agreed to this duel against his will, but if Roman lost now, Fabius watched the incredibly bright flash of the battle that flashed together, and he wondered if all his efforts to recruit Roman would make any sense. Thaler, flushed, asked Fabius in a trembling voice that Roman was definitely not going to lose. Butler threw a huge number of punches with great speed. Roman parried them with dexterity, but his strength ended. Teeth ran forward, his cheek cut and bleeding. The warrior standing on the fortress clenched his fist. And then, along with their comrades, they cheered for Butler. The fighter, raising his hand up with a tear in his eye, shouted for Butler to avenge their comrades. Bright purple and yellow flashes could be seen in the heat of battle. Roman fiercely slashed at Butler's sword without sparing any strength. Butler thought that Roman's counterattacks were getting faster and faster. Butler looked up into Roman's mad, smiling face, then wondered if Roman wasn't just parrying, and his sword was following the path of his sword, really. Startled, Butler blocked the blow and gritted his teeth, wondering if Roman was really studying him. Roman stared at Butler for a moment, then wondered if he could finally understand his position in the new world. It only took him one hit to defeat a 4-star Homer, but he couldn't beat a 5-star swordsman. Now he must look up to Butler with respect. Roman's sword lit up with a purple aura. He made a quick jump and wondered what was just him. Roman made a serious face with his sword thrust forward, and then thought that he should break this wall and climb to a new level. Butler shouted frantically that Roman was an impudent boy. And then Butler jumped in Roman's direction, his vengeance glowing even brighter as he used an aura burst, clearly showing the disadvantages of an uncontrolled release of Kai. Those who work with aura swordsmen, they control mana with jewel-like precision and spew out power like an explosion. In other words, the power covering all parts of the sword is not balanced among themselves. If a sharper sword exposes 120% of the aura's power, then the blunt side only carries 80% of the power. Roman swung his sword and thought that if he could read the mana streams, he would be able to figure out the weakness. Roman's punch landed on the weak side, which hit Butler hard. But Butler continued to resist, deflecting Roman's blows. Roman glared at Butler and wondered why exactly he was using the third style right now. A black aura appeared in front of Butler's face, and when he saw it, he was very scared, because there was nothing he could do. Even the 5-star swordsman was pushed back. The people on both sides were in shock, their faces showing shock. Hector's soldier looked down in fright, then asked how this was possible. Butler was on his knees, blood slowly dripping from his mouth. His body was covered in bruises, but his gaze didn't change. He was just as confident. The walls of the castle were shouting that Roman Dimitri was a 3-star swordsman. How the hell could he fight on equal terms with 5-star swordsman Butler? Edwin was startled, gritting his teeth, and wondered if Roman really wanted a fair fight, without any traps, if Butler suddenly lost to Dimitri Roman. Edwin watched the tired Butler. The ground around him where Butler had fought with Roman was cracked, and he thought that the worst outcome could not be imagined. They would not only lose the strongest warrior in the kingdom, but also be forced to leave the rear fortress. Edwin looked down and furrowed his brows, thinking desperately that he could only believe in Butler, right, since Butler hadn't used his full strength yet. Butler leaned on his sword. He gradually began to get up. Looking at Roman, he thought that this boy turned out to be a real psycho. Butler coughed up blood, then reflected that he had assumed the duel would be an excuse to trap him, but Roman was absolutely serious about trying to crush him. Butler stared at the confident Roman, his eyes glowing, and then he thought that their seemingly perfect plan had started to fall apart because such an unlikely individual had suddenly appeared on the southern front. If Roman Dimitri is released alive, then one day the kingdom of Hector may face a monster that they can stand up to. Butler's body began to get covered with an even stronger aura. He thought that this was why he had to kill Roman Dimitri by all means, and then Butler told Kama that he would spare no effort. Butler's eyes began to glow a bright yellow. He raised his shining sword to the sky. The energy that was in it began to be redirected upwards, and a huge shining fireball appeared there. So far only 2 people were able to repel Butler's attack. The first was the strongest sword kingdom of Hector, and the second entered the continental ranking. Butler frowned and shouted that it was all over. He used the secret technique Sunstrike, and the fireball flew towards Roman with great force and speed. Roman, without moving, looked in his direction, pointing his sword there. Roman then opened his eyes wide, reflecting Butler's spell as he thought that if he came face to face with this secret technique at his current level, he would definitely die, in which case he should only focus on defense. A dark purple shield began to form around Roman's body, and he thought that if this was Butler's most powerful weapon, then he had the strongest shield in the Sky Demon's arsenal. Roman was looking at Butler's approaching secret technique with a serious face as he used the Heavenly Demon Sword technique Iron Block. Butler's technique smashed into Roman's shield with great speed. The ground around him started to burn, cracks appearing everywhere. Edwin watched in horror, still hoping that Butler would win. Butler's technique started absorbing Roman's shield. A huge rumble was heard, and Roman thought about Butler attacking. He smiled snidely and then wondered if it was Butler's spear or his shield. Butler gritted his teeth as he watched. They needed to find out which was stronger. A huge burst of flame engulfed Roman's shield. After a while, a huge layer of dust began to dissipate. Someone stepped forward on the broken ground. Edwin looked in that direction in fright and then asked how. Roman's shield started to dissipate. Butler was standing in front of him. There was an incredibly deep chasm surrounding Roman. Roman smiled as he looked at Butler, then thought that even a 5-star swordsman couldn't fend off this attack. Roman smiled broadly. Butler was barely able to stand up. He was breathing heavily. And then he thought that he had spent too much mana on this strike. But he can't just give up, and Butler screamed and charged into the battle again, a yellow aura surrounding him. Roman also took off. They crossed swords again in a duel. Suddenly, Roman was able to push Butler back. But Butler managed to react and put a sword in front of him. He thought that how is this possible? He passed fire and water on the battlefields, pushed back by a boy who was barely 20 years old. Butler desperately reflected Roman's blows, which again and again overtook him. He thought that he could not just give up, even if he did not know what to do. If he dies right here. All of a sudden, Roman quickly ran up to Butler and grabbed his face, but there was nothing Butler could do about it. Roman slammed Butler's head into the ground with great force. Butler groaned at the sheer force of it, but he had to take this monster that was threatening the prince's life with him. After a few seconds, Butler's head began to glow, and Roman noticed it too late. At the place where Butler was lying and Roman was standing, there was an incredible explosion of yellow energy. Roman stood over Butler and then swung his sword and said that he would remember his will. Butler watched in horror as his own death drew near. Suddenly, Roman noticed something from above as he was striking. Edwin shouted stop with a desperate face, and then used the flash rune spell. A huge flame headed towards Roman from the tower. Roman looked ahead, startled. Then, at the last moment, he dodged the flames. Edwin stretched out his hand and then shouted, "Save Commander Butler," as the knights rushed out of the city walls shouting, "Senseless monster, don't you dare touch our commander." The knights ran forward with tears in their eyes, and Hector gave up hope of winning the duel. Roman slaughtered the knights one by one. Hector, Edwin disowned his reputation in the world community, and chose to save Butler. Roman gritted his teeth and glared viciously ahead, and then thought that as a result, access to the fortress gate was finally open. He should not miss this chance. We are transported to the moment before the battle, when Roman and the commanders were discussing tactics. Fabius said that they would imagine that a miracle would happen after all, but what their next actions would be. Roman calmly replied that after the battle with Hector in the mountains, he had watched him from afar. Edwin watched from the mountain as Hector's fighters gathered their fallen comrades. Even after a sleepless night in battle, they went down the mountain to take care of the bodies of all the fallen comrades. Even though they needed to hurry up and crush the remaining defensive strongholds on the southern front, they mourned and burned the corpses of their fellow soldiers. Edwin Hector is such a sensitive commander-in-chief that he even gives the dates time to say goodbye. And Roman plans to exploit this weakness. Fabius asked, puzzled. Roman confidently replied that Butler would be a push that could break Edwin's judgment. Roman smiled and said that if he crushed Butler, it would fully satisfy the conditions of the original plan. Roman's plan is not to kill Butler in one hit, but to make him no longer able to fight. Roman smiled broadly, then went on to say what if Edwin Hector decided to save Butler? Then they will start implementing the second plan. We are transported back to the battlefield. Roman smashing Hector's knights one by one. The knights run normally without fear and shout that they need to attack him. You need to buy time to save the commander. Roman, while killing Hector's knights one by one, wondered what Edwin Hector was doing. Roman savagely slashed several knights in one blow, then reflected that Edwin was undoubtedly a great ruler, but he didn't belong in a war. Several soldiers ran up to Butler, shouting that first of all, we need to save Butler and buy time. Archers standing on the walls of the female thought that Roman was mixed with his allies. They can't attack him. Looking at this, Fabius was puzzled, thinking that everything was really going as Roman had said. Fabius watched as a huge number of warriors surrounded Roman to save Butler, and then Fabius said that everything was going as if by magic. Fabius smiled, then reflected that Roman Dimitri was the most talented warrior in Cairo's history. And now he understood why Marquis Benedict did not disdain any means to recruit him. Fabius was startled to think that it was enough to get Roman to deal with the incompetent king, and with the puppets of two empires. Fabius raised his hand forward and shouted, Cairo's army, charge. A huge number of soldiers immediately charged into the battle, the ground shaking as they approached. Edwin, looking at what was happening, wondered if his rash decision had led to such a situation. Edwin fell into despair, and he reflected that he was a poor fool. that as the commander-in-chief, he should have kept his cool and clear mind to the last. Edwin took a deep breath, then reflected that seeing Butler's defeat had made him lose his mind. A magic sphere appeared in Edwin's hands, and he thought that no, it wasn't over yet, as long as they saved Butler and closed the fortress gates, and there was still a chance of winning. Edwin furiously looked ahead and cast a spell, Flash Rune. A huge pillar of fire flew straight at Cairo's knights, and immediately covered several of them in flames. Several mages standing on the walls shouted that they needed to help the prince, and they used the same Flash Rune spell. Along with the battle, numerous fiery explosions fell. Fabius furrowed his brows and pointed around, shouting for the warriors to spread out around the perimeter and launch an assault. If they missed the chance while the gate was open, they would lose even more lives. On the walls of the castle stood a young man with green hair. It was Hector's knight Kellen, who slammed his hand on the wall and then said a curse. He looked at the wounded butler and then thought that it was necessary to close the gate as soon as possible, and asked the soldiers to hurry up in their thoughts. A shout was heard from below that Mr. Butler inside needs to close the gate. Roman gritted his teeth furiously, looked to the side and shouted now. Edwin shouted from the castle walls that as soon as the gate was closed, they should cast a protective spell on it. Roman was approaching the closing gate at great speed. Kellen looked down in fright and shouted that Dimitri. Roman was approaching the castle gate with a mad smile. Several knights crowded around the entrance to the castle and shouted that this was not the only thing they needed to stop Roman quickly. Roman's eyes filled with dark energy as he continued to run. And then he flew into the castle gate, the knights blocking his way, flying in different directions along with the castle gate. The dust began to dissipate, and Roman's silhouette was visible as he walked towards the ruined castle gate. Roman then turned to his warriors and shouted loudly that the fortress gates were open. Cairo's army do not hesitate and attack. The commander stood near his soldiers shouting that it was necessary to defeat the remnants of Hector's army, after which all the warriors shouted and rushed into battle, fighting between each other. All warriors begin to fight. Someone removes their weapons, someone defends themselves, everywhere a bloody mess. Warriors go out of their way to kill the enemy, and they shed their first blood, and there are pools of blood everywhere. Then the novel is published. But he thinks to himself that the plan to open the fortress gate has succeeded. He walks with a serious face and his cheeks are covered in cuts. And he thinks that now there is only one goal left. He goes outside, walking forward, and standing in front of Edwin Hector. Speaking of being left alone, Edwin, on the other hand, looks around at the novels and thinks to himself that from what point everything went downhill. He stands and thinks that the fact that he was attacked, that the serfs in the rear were conquered, proves the correctness of his decision. And obviously, his plan was perfect. But as he looks at the wounded Roman, he thinks that until he showed up, Edwin begins to burn and burn. I think that's right, it's all his fault. He remembers how his knights were killed by Chris, and how they were defeated in the conquest of the 5th line of defense because of him. And the way Kevin cut up his enemies, slicing them apart, jumping on top of them, losing about 1,000 of Hector's soldiers fighting against a partisan in the mountains. Remembering how the soldiers died, looking up, lying on the floor and pulling their hand up, saying that if God exists, then he would like to ask him, why did he force the new star of the kingdom of Hector to be born? And why did they send him Dimitri? Roman then interrupts his discussion and tells him that they have finally met again. Edwin says that's right, this moment has finally arrived. After that, it's a serious face. His eye starts to burn red. He says that even if he is going to die today, he will definitely drag him to the next world with him. After which, he releases the circle using magic and shouts Dimitri's name. Then he creates a ball with his other hand. Speaking of which, it's a wind blade. In the smoking bill, he directs all of his attacks on Dimitri while standing under the red dome, and creating another spell. Roman, in turn, just stands there and cuts through all the wind blades with a single swing of his weapon. Roman stiffens and looks directly at Edwin. At this time, the soldiers run and say that they need to protect the prince and stop Dimitri. Then the 3 knights jump on Roman. They were aura soldiers and used their own aura. Some are shouting at him to die by jumping right into it. After which, Roman notices that his eye starts to shine, and he uses the heavenly demon sword technique 2 style. He cuts these knights into 2 pieces, bursting forward using his blade. Then he notices that something is attacking him from below. I see a huge tree growing right above the novel, snatching it out of its tangle. After that, Edwin uses magic and creates the Path of Inferno. This tree, along with the novel, begins to burn with flames. But a blade appears from there and cuts through this tree along with this fire. When Edwin uses blue magic, says that it's true, he's not one of those opponents who fell out after such a thing. Then he asks him how he uses the shining blade. And Romana is struck by lightning. Edwin starts to smile and thinks to himself what he did, after which Roman stands behind Edwin and tells him that he recognizes his strength. Then he swings and hits Edwin. It turns out to be Roman's blade, and he says this is the end. Then blood is spilled on Edwin and he turns to see what happened. And one of the knights protected him with his body, and Roman pierced him with his blade. He tells Edwin that he is a prince. He starts crying and tells him to run. And that's when Edwin starts crying and yelling what the hell. He knelt down in front of the corpse of his colleague and screams about no. He continues to cry and scream, and his rage begins to boil. Then Roman brings his blade to his neck. It's guilt and says what a pity. Edwin looks at Roman and Roman tells him that there is nothing. Soon, he would follow. After that, many soldiers run towards Roman shouting his name. And he notices this and begins to dodge their blows. He uses his skills to cut through everything around him, and parrying the swing of the warriors who approached first. And then Jackson grabs Edwin and runs away, yelling at him to come to his senses, and he's actually planning to die here. Jackson runs away, holding Edwin and shouting that if they get the nickname cowardly defeated, then he must live to the last, so as not to devalue the decision of everyone who sacrificed their lives for him. And he starts crying. After that, soldiers from all over the castle shout from the walls that they need to leave the fortresses to everyone to retreat. Their main task, looking at the novels, is to stop it and buy time. Many soldiers stand and shout that the prince must survive and shout after him that he must live. After that, these soldiers are killed by Roman Dimitri using his power. From a huge flash, make a hit from something that the knights didn't even realize. Edwin wakes up and watches as Roman runs after him, cutting all the knights into small pieces. He looks at him and says he's the devil at the way Roman smiles and his eyes glow purple. After that, one of the half-dead soldiers tells him that, having won the battle, can he retreat? To which Roman, looking at the soldier sitting on his lap, says that I remember, warned that the next time you meet them, he will kill them all, standing in a small pit. Looking at this soldier, there are many bloodied corpses everywhere. Roman says they were the ones who started this war, and the fragrance says that stop whining and that they are the victim here. After that, he cuts off his head, and it flies off. Many soldiers run to the entrance and shout that Hector's entire army has retreated and the victory is for Cairo. After that, the commanders of the camera country enter first, followed by the knights. They think to themselves that where did Roman Dimitri go? After which they all come in shock. They watch as there are a lot of corpses lying around, and Roman is sitting in the highlands. A person who decided the outcome of a once-losing war. The value of Dimitri's novel reached unprecedented heights. They look at the whole bloodied Roman sitting there with a smile, and says that he was waiting for them. After all, with the help of this war, it will soar to the skies. A grand victory for Cairo. Looking at the city capital, the news of this has yet to reach the capital of Kervas. All the people are discussing something and asking each other if they have heard the news, to which others ask what happened. And they say that the army of the kingdom of Hector has crossed the border, and now they are attacking the southern front. Men sit in a bar and discuss what's going on. They sit at a table and talk about how traders who have come from the south say that the situation there is extremely difficult. To which another man with yellow hair says that he feels about being forcibly called up for service. And a beefy man with a mug in his hand says that he quit because nothing happened when the empire attacked them. And here they will be summoned because of some attack of the kingdom. After that, a lot of people continue to discuss this and say that at least they sat quietly and did not come again and did not rise up for the war. They start complaining about the fact that in this cursed country at least one day, is it possible to live normally? It's their fault that they were born in the small kingdom it's heading for. After that, the events are transferred to the Royal Kira Academy of Class D rank. And the next one will be William Castro and Lawrence Dimitri. A man with yellow hair and a green uniform with yellow eyebrows is holding a wooden sword. He is a Class D rank William Castro. Next to him is a black-haired guy with purple eyes, and you can see that he is very worried. This was Class D rank Lawrence Dimitri. Then the knight tells them to start by shouting it, and the two start attacking each other by jumping. Lawrence defends against William's attacks. It's hard for him, and he steps back. At that time, William continues to persist and strike at him. Then Roman, gritting his teeth, realizes that he is walking away. He starts screaming. Then he throws a punch, but it misses, and William hits him squarely on the neck. He says he's a weakling by looking down on him. Then he makes his own kick, and he falls to the ground and writhes in pain. He gets up from the ground, clearly having a hard time. And William. She stands next to him and looks at him with a smile. Everyone watching says that, as expected, from him. After all, the Raven, Dimitri. After that, the knight stands over Lawrence and tells him that he claimed that by entering the Royal Academy, he would learn the art of swordsmanship. And he can't even follow the opponent's sword, squinting his eyes in fear. He keeps looking at him with a serious face and says what a pathetic sight it is. Lawrence is sitting on the floor, looking at him. He is clearly scared. and the other continues to tell him that if he shows up during the exam as well, he can start preparing for transfer to the class. After that, he feels sorry for Lucky and thinks to himself that classy, if he has to go to class by the age of 15 at the age of 18, no one will take him seriously. After that, Lawrence sits on the bench and is sad. And then William and his company pass by him. He notices Lawrence sitting on the bench, and he sees what he's sitting there and asks him, "Look who's sitting there." He walks up to him and looks at him, smiling, saying things that are funny, really. Lawrence draws attention to him, and he tells him that the S-class parent mentor was so amazing that he was admired by everyone. He looks at him with obvious disdain, and he says that because of this, as a child, he thought that all the people of the Dimitri family were outstanding warriors. What does he see here? Remembering what the head of the family looked like, which didn't seem to last long, he forgot that there was such a thing as an origin limit. Remembering Rodville, they say that it is a miracle that such a person as Mr. Rodville was born without his own family. William starts to smile as he looks at Lawrence, saying that miracles don't happen twice to the same family. And then Lawrence lowers his head in silence and thinks to himself that this is how his brother's name always haunts him. And then the other two guys who came with William come over. The black-haired guy says that it's so uninteresting, and the guy with blue hair sighs and smiles and says that it's generally true that Roman Dimitri beat Homer. To which William says that the head on the cutoff gives that these rumors were spread by the family itself. Dimitriv, smiling and looking at Lawrence, and it is necessary to somehow solve the issue of the firstborn, who became the fool of the Dimitri family. He keeps looking at Lawrence and tells him that if you just look at him, he'll know. At that time, Lawrence gets nervous and lowers his head. Speaking of which, the three sons of the Dimitri family are useless. After which, Lawrence walks down the street and thinks that the news about his brother Roman is true. Although in my memories, he wasn't a bad person going forward. But as William said, I don't think my brother beat Homer. He starts to worry, gritting his teeth and says that anyone will say it's a lie. And then he notices a lot of townspeople talking at the entrance. He is surprised by this and steps forward, thinking what a pandemonium it is. And the townspeople are talking among themselves and saying that is it really true? And they tell him that it is. The man also says that he was told about it by relatives living in the south. And he says that Hector almost crushed the southern front, but miraculously managed to win it back. And all the people pay attention to the shirt man, and he talks about what he knows, which is even more shocking. He remembers Roman standing in front of a huge cloud of smoke. And he says that the biggest contribution to this was made by Roman Dimitri. People start rushing somewhere and think that's the young ranker who killed Homer. Total says that it's exactly what he says, that he forced Hector's kingdom to retreat with only 200 soldiers under his command. Well, they say that's not all, and in a duel, he defeated the 5-star swordsman Butler, remembering how Roman had slain that swordsman with his punch, and it was so unthinkable that he couldn't believe it. After which, Lawrence, watching this, is very surprised, not understanding what is happening, and he thinks to himself that they are talking inaccurately about Roman's brother, whom he knows. He opens his mouth in surprise as he listens to all the townspeople and thinks to himself that he repelled Hector's attack with an army of 200 people and defeated the swordsman Aura Hector on top of that. Is this outright nonsense? After that, a man dressed in a soldier's uniform shouts to everyone to make way. After all, the heroes of the southern lands are coming. After that, Roman enters from there on a horse and many soldiers follow him. All passers-by step out of the way and yell for him to get out of the way. A lot of people look at Roman Dimitri, and Lawrence notices him. Roman hears something and turns around. He was shouted over by Lawrence that his brother was Roman. After that, the events are transferred to the king, who is sitting on the throne. He tells Roman departed that they finally met. Roman sits down on one knee, covered in blood, and says that he greets his majesty. Other men are standing nearby. The king on the throne says he wanted to sincerely thank him on behalf of the entire kingdom. After all, he had shown true will to Caire. To which the king begins to burst out, looking at Roman and asking him what he wants and saying that he is ready to fulfill any of his wishes, if it is in his power. Roman looks at him seriously, and he goes on to say that, by the way, he is just looking for a successor to the strong sword of Caire, and the captain of the royal knights to Count Nicholas. The king starts to smile, but at the same time he is worried and tells him that if he wants to, he will grant him the title of vice-captain and grant him the right of free entry to the royal family's treasury, as well as release him from the remaining one. Who thinks about it? And Roman, sitting on his knees, thinks that the king has bared his teeth. He takes it all as if he is a scarecrow, and because of the imminent death of the last king, he ascended to the throne at an early age. He became the Scarecrow King. After which, the king clenches his hand into a fist and thinks to himself that if Roman becomes his man, the aristocracy faction will no longer dare to oppress him. He makes it look like a lot of aristocrats are standing over him, smiling and pushing him, because he thinks that people call him the sissy king, but it can't go on like this. Then Benedict calls him. He says that where is it seen, to put a new sense on someone else's shoulders under the pretext of a reward. It was the faction of the aristocracy Marquis Benedict. With a serious face, he continues to say that only coercion will sacrifice a young talent who would guarantee a bright future for the country, and he asks to withdraw this order. And everyone in this room is saying what's right. They agree to give him access to the royal family's treasury, but the rest is too much. To which Roman tells the Marquis Benedict that he has made up his mind, and the latter, in turn, is very surprised by this, paying attention to him. The king points his hand at Roman and says that he must make his own choice. And everyone around was very surprised by this and shocked. Roman sits with a serious face and thinks that he still feels royal blood. Rabat then closes his eyes, sits down on one knee, and says that it is a great honor for a swordsman to be awarded the title of Royal Knight, but he has something he would like to do before deciding on his future. To which the king begins to worry, looking at Roman and thinking about what it is. And Roman says that this war helped him realize that he was just a frog stuck in a well, remembering how small their country was. And says that outside of the kingdom, the current me is nothing with them, so they need time to prepare to go out into the big world by opening their eyes, and once he is ready, he will challenge the official battle of rankers. He begins to glow with his mother and purple hue and looks at the king with a smile. He says that he will try to move up from the 99th place to the first to test the limit of his ability. The king, sitting on the throne, asks Roman, who is on his knees, about what the official battle of the rankers. Roman says yes, showing how two men fight with swords and that this is an official battle means an endless series of challenges. 99th place in the rating of Kira Jatan against the 98th place of the rating of Cairo Delhi, and they clash heads until they lose. And after one stands at the top and two falls to the ground. After all, when the opponent falls to his knees, a 10-place file rating becomes Bruno's 9th place, and a 9-place file rating, on the contrary, becomes Jerry's 10th place, and his place in the ranking goes to him. After that, the king looks at the novels in surprise and asks him if the official battle is dangerous, and that he can lose his life. It's not something you can talk about so easily, and Roman looks back and says he knows. The king was very frightened and surprised. At the same time, looking down on Roman. He thinks about how he could have gained immense fame and wealth, but he gave it all up in order to take on a new challenge. And that's amazing self-confidence. After which, all the nobles standing nearby are hearing the news. Discussing what was expected of Kyr's character is incredible. The fact that the battle between them is already looking forward to. They smile. They say he took down the butler of Hector himself. Who can stop him? Benedict very anxiously thinks to himself that he will reject the offer to become a knight of the king. After all, he said that he wants to show his own value, and he sees no reason to stop him because this is not so bad. After that, Grigory and the other aristocrat are very worried, smiling and showing their displeasure that Romanov is only in his early 22nd, and with the help of the official ranking battle, they will be able to assess his true ability. After that, they remember how he went to the battlefield ahead, saying that very soon and in front of all of them he will show who he really is, and even then he will decide who will go on the path next. Saying all this to the king while bowing down in front of him. And Roman smiles sitting down. Begins to dream that when the battle is over and Roman Dimitri will become no one's sword, but the owner of a new territory. Then Benedict pours wine into a glass. He takes this glass, sits down in his chair and says that this is a funny thing for a person. He's sitting next to another man, sipping his wine, and talking about how, out of concern for his safety, he sent him to the southern front and Hector should have declared war at that very moment. Roman sits with his eyes closed, and the same one drinks wine from a glass. Benedict says that he will think only he insisted on them and became the hero of Kyr. After that, he says that, thanks to him, he gained a good experience by opening his eyes. Benedict is surprised by this and clearly shows displeasure, saying that what a good experience it can be. And Roman says that yes, the war with Hector helped him realize that the world is much bigger than he thought, remembering how he fought with a strong knight. So he wants to challenge the official Kyr rankers war. He stares at the wine in his glass, swirling it around and talking about becoming Samo, testing out how strong the kingdom is and when it will eventually become no one else's superior. He wants to go out and become the strongest in the entire continent. To which Benedict, closing his eyes, looks at Roman, says that he is the strongest on the continent and once he had a similar dream. He remembers how he fought as allies and enemies, and all the people he came in contact with. Thinking that unlike him, he chose to be content with a filial life only after he realized how great it was. After that, Benedict opens his mouth and says that he has a daughter, and since the child lost her mother early, he raised her in exceptional care. Roman watches Benedict say this, and Benedict crosses his arms and looks back. He says that he will give him his daughter. Roman is very surprised by this. Benedict says, looking at him, that he has heard from Fabio that he is far from simple. So it is today, looking at how he says that he will challenge the battle of rankers. Benedict is encouraged and says that he has once again remembered the monsters that he met on the continent in his youth. He remembers the people he saw and how strong they were standing behind them. Speaking of which, even though he wasn't a match for them and wasn't born with outstanding talent, but to some extent, he has a way of recognizing them. After which, Benedict tells him with full confidence in his eyes that Roman Dimitri will reach such a height that they will be able to compete with them on equal terms. So it goes without saying that he knows that his engagement is over and is also not going to force his daughter on him. However, he will arrange a meeting for them. Thinking back to how his daughter looks with blonde hair, if there is any sympathy between them, then he will only be good for their relationship. Holds out Roman's hand and says that he doesn't want, that he has to meet her right now, so he has to remember one truth, that in the past, that now he is Marquis Benedict, always ready to watch his back. With full confidence in his eyes, he keeps looking at Roman, reaches out, and says that if he ever says he's ready to commit the future to them, then he can have everything he wants in this kingdom. What's new is how much wealth and gold he can give Roman, after all, exists. This upsets the balance of power, and whoever takes it will consume the entire kingdom of Cairo. After that, he discussed everything with the other factions of Cairo, and each of the 4 owners wanted to get it, smiling and showing signs of attention. They were very eager to possess it, talking about what they would be able to give him and the subsequent wait for her offers from Count Gregory, and Count Denver was also amazing. But Roman, sitting on many corpses, says that, however, he is a heavenly demon, and he was a man who couldn't live under anyone else. After that, night falls and they find themselves in their mansion. The services shout to him, young master, that he is fine, nowhere, nor injured, shaking him back and forth, and very worried. After all, he had come to the capital to take care of Roman. He begins to cry and scream, clutching Roman's cloak, saying that he has no idea how his heart trembled as yours truly and when he heard the rumors from the southern front and news about him. After all, what a blessing that he came back safe and sound. After that, Roman says with a calm face that he is fine, and his servant asks if this is true while continuing to freak out and cry. On the table is a hot mug of tea. It's been a few days. Mr. Roman is sitting on a chair in a shirt and tie, holding a mug of tea in his hands, and a servant comes up to him with a teapot and asks him, saying that this may sound rude. He smiles and is worried at the same time, saying that they couldn't possibly meet young Master Lawrence, remembering how immediately after Roman entered the capital and the capital estate of the Dimitri family, remembering how young Mr. Lawrence comes to him, and he is very surprised by this. He, in turn, approaches him with a confused look and says that he is glad to see him. He begins to discuss with him what happened, and they're both in shock. Hans looks at him and is very surprised by this. He says that he took care of the young gentleman from their early years, and I was able to understand from the first glance that young Master Lawrence was in some kind of trouble right now. Remembering how he starts rubbing his hand on his head, worrying and looking away. So he waited for the young master to speak one, and the young master asks him. Then at this point, Lawrence, so that he can talk and not be shy, he smilingly says that what happened to his older brother Roman, and not so long ago he saw him enter the capital surrounded by security. He recalls how many people, smiling, said that brother Roman defeated ranker Hector, and Hans tells him that a lot has happened in his family during his absence. Lawrence is very surprised by this and listens to Hans saying that he must also have heard some rumors about the young master that are going around the world, and these rumors are all true. Remembering how he broke off his engagement to the Lawrence family, thus throwing off the chains from Flora, and remembering how he defeated Homer by joining the Barca family war by cutting him into 2 pieces. And this time he performed a brilliant feat on the southern front, telling about everything inspiring. After which, Lawrence was very much afraid of this and was surprised while lowering his head. He thinks to himself that these rumors were true, and remembering how the father and mother stood and smiled, because lately even the father cannot get enough of it. After all, the change of young Master Roman. Then Hans goes on to say, while Lawrence is very surprised by this, what about not feeding yourself? Talk about meeting young Master Roman in person, because he will be returning to the manor this evening. To which Lawrence, very frightened, shows with his own hands that it is not necessary to say that no, it is not necessary and thank you for his work. After which he leaves, the Pahan looks at him and thinks that all 3 brothers of Dimitri have different temperament, and among them, the young master has the most vulnerable soul. After that, they stand with a teapot, saying that it seems to him that the young master is being bullied at the academy. Roman sips his tea, and the latter continues to say that he thinks that he wanted to ask for help, but did not dare to ask about it himself. After that, Roman, putting away a mug of tea, thought about the fact that his younger brother, is a big age difference. He puts the cup down on the table and thinks that there's no need to take care of him just because he's his little brother. But he also thinks about turning to Hansu and telling him that it will be nice to meet him, and Hansu is very surprised at this while holding the teapot. He smiles and says thank you so much, and the latter looks at him and is very surprised that for some reason he thought that since this is Hansu's request, why not fulfill it? Sitting on a chair and looking at it. After that, someone quickly goes somewhere and thinks to himself that the recruitment of Roman Dimitri has been postponed indefinitely, but he still has a way to snatch benefits for the Marquis. It was Count Fabio, who is in a hurry somewhere. He begins to smile very much and show his nature. Speaking of which, I'm sure he'll be happy. Fabius walks forward and remembers all the knights he fought, thinking to himself that even though people's attention is focused on the novel alone, but in reality, his subordinates can't be called weaklings either. And if he can recruit them by looking at him, smiling, then I'm sure Marquis Benedict will be happy. Remembering Chris and the way he swung his sword and showed himself on the battlefield by using mana. After all, especially him with such a talent, any aristocrat in the capital would welcome him with open arms. And he remembers the other knights, how he stood and watched them fight, because on the other hand, Sambo never found out about it, and having visited the southern front personally. And they are all more than worthy to join their ranks. I think of Roman's army, and all you have to do is win them over from all their subordinates, including Chris, and they would have the Marquis's trust in no time. After that, Chris swings his sword, training and thinking that you in one meeting the distance to the Lord did not exceed an outstretched arm, so he believed that one day he could surpass him, continuing to train hard. And then he remembers how he fought against a 5-star knight. Speaking of which, the gentleman has already risen to an unfathomable level, and the fight with Butler was a special shock for him. And how on earth is this possible? Then he points, looking at the lock, and sighs. Using his aura and taking off his shirt, I think that he is still following the master, and in the past 6 months, he has made such a leap in growth that it is hard to believe even for himself. He gritted his teeth, lowered his head, and thought about how he couldn't stop there, because he was serious about surpassing his master one day. Then he sees Fabio's coming up behind him, and very smilingly calls him to her. They say that here he is. He says he wants to get straight to the point. He stands in front of him and tells him that he wants to hire him if he joins him. After which, Chris says he's not interested, turning to Fabio's. He is surprised by this, looking at him and starts shouting that this is his chance to change his life radically. But he will refuse even without listening to the conditions. And what is his problem? He puts his hand on his chest and keeps shouting that if it's about money, he can give it enough to last him a lifetime. If in glory, then by accompanying Marquis Benedict the powerful man to central government's honorary position. Chris stares at him in silence, not showing any interest, and he continues to shout that he has nothing in Cairo that he can't get in as soon as he wants. He throws up his hands and starts shouting that if suddenly he is worried that this will be regarded as a betrayal of Mr. Roman, then this is not true, right? Eventually, Mr. Roman will also become the Marquis's man. What's wrong with bringing this moment closer? Chris then turns around and tells him that how can he be so sure that the master will become the Marquis Benedict's man. He speaks in surprise, remembering the Marquis standing over Roman and holding him by the shoulders. Speaking of which, it is obvious, because there is no one in Cairo who would abandon the current government. After that, Chris squints very hard and thinks to himself that this man doesn't know a damn thing about the master, remembers how Roman is standing, putting your foot on the head of one of the people. Speaking of which, Romaine would never bend the knee to anyone else in her life. Chris then confidently looks on and says that no matter what he suggests, he is not going to leave the master. Remembering how he and the remaining knights are walking, looking at Roman's back, because no one can replace him. Fabios then bows to him and tells him that if that's what he says, then so be it. And Chris tells him in return that if he suddenly plans to win over his other comrades to his side, he advises him to give up right away. He looks at him with a serious face and says that neither of them will make their choice in favor of the other. Then he leaves. Chris watches him go. He thinks about how he made him laugh, and he doesn't think there's anyone else who's willing to turn down such a unique chance. He approaches Kevin, and Kevin angrily tells him that he is the master of his whole life, and that he would rather die than serve someone else. To which he was very much worried, surprised, thinking to himself that how he decided this. And he went up to another of Roman's soldiers, who scratched his head and said in surprise that he had not received the master's consent, and if he did not have it, then let them pretend that this conversation had not taken place. He's starting to worry. It is said that he does not want to interfere between the master, since he would remain a nobody. And he won't even dare to think about betraying him, after which the other looks at him with very great surprise and incomprehension, holding out his hand. He is very angry, gritting his teeth, thinking to himself that this is true, that this is Autumn's betrayal. After that, one of the knights runs up to him and looks at him very surprised. He gets agitated, twisting his head and holding it with his hands. Fabio's momentarily doesn't understand what's going on and just watches it happen. He does not understand and is very surprised at what their unwavering loyalty is. After that, Lawrence trains with swords. He beats up the pair, hitting it with all your might. He breaks it, continuing to make his attacks. After which, he got up and went to take a breather and think to himself with his head down and holding his hands, that lately even the Baron couldn't get enough of young Master Roman's changes. He grits his teeth and thinks to himself what the hell happened to Brother Roman. He continues to beat with the sword and thinks to himself that from the fool Dimitri from the very young rank, and now he is being praised as the hero who defeated Butler. He is very angry as he opens his mouth and thinks to himself, if Big Brother has changed so much, then why hasn't he been able to remember yet the one he lost to? And he makes attacks, saying that it's not so pathetic after all. Then he collapses to the ground, breathing heavily. He closes his eyes and starts to moan, and that's when someone comes up to him. It was Roman, and he goes up to him and asks what he's doing here. He jumps up in surprise, calling him brother. Roman looks away and says that Hans told him that he was looking for him. Then Lawrence gets to his feet, and Roman tells him that if he wants to say something, he should say it right now. Then Lawrence grabs the top of his head and starts scratching it, looking away, saying it's nothing serious. Roman looks at him and says he's a pathetic little boy, and turns around and starts walking away, while Lawrence looks at someone walking around. They realize what he has done and start shouting that he will tell everything and tell everything to Roman. He starts to get angry, and at the same time, he turns around and listens to him. They're sitting on a bench, and Lawrence says that when he heard the rumors about him, he didn't believe it at first. Roman is standing next to him, and Lawrence is sitting on a bench, telling him that the brother he remembered wasn't just unable to hold his sword. He even asked him to go to the military service with him. After that, Roman thinks about the fact that somewhere about a year ago, his memories are not so long ago. His father continues to talk, clenching a fist on his knee, about how they've changed beyond recognition in the time they haven't seen each other, and now people look at him and call him a hero. How did he manage to change so much? There are tears in his eyes, and he starts shouting that they were the same, who the menacing ones didn't have any hopes for, and he wants to be like him. He also wants to become the pride of his father, remembering how he was. He starts crying and tries to wipe the tears away with his hand. And he says not to force a smile at every meeting, to pretend that everything is fine, and he will cope, and he wants to show what success he can achieve. Roman, looking at this, keeps thinking to himself that he is a very soft child, and he is barely 8, and he is not strong enough to withstand the weight of reality. And he thinks to himself, looking at his feet, how should he use Slovenian? He remembers all his life and what all the locals took of the new novel. They smiled back at him, and they didn't dwell on the perception that they already had, but looked with a new look and everything changed. Roman thinks to himself that it's the same with him, whether it's Lawrence or his other brother. His assessment should be based not on memories from the past, but on past experience. Then he approaches Lawrence, and they call out his name, and he calls out, and Roman tells him, looking at him until he looks up, that he doesn't want to see a man with the same last name being ridiculed and persecuted. He says that this spoils the authority of not only the Dimitri family, but in particular, him. Then looking at Squishy, Lawrence says that if he wants to get an answer to his question, then he must prove in the fencing exam that he is worthy of it. Remembering that in the previous life, the brothers had no choice but to kill each other. But Roman, unlike that time in this life, wanted to give the brothers a chance by standing up and telling him all this. Many green uniformed cadets stand at attention in front of the black uniformed instructor. He says that he will start the fencing exam soon, after which he watches all the cadets and says that one is next. After that, the other cadets watch as 2 of them compete. Lawrence stands and watches. I think to myself that if he wants to answer the question, then he must prove that he is worthy. After which it stands. He is told that there will be the next him and he must take a step forward. He confidently says that there is and makes it. His opponents become red-haired William Castro, saying that he should also take a step forward. He looks at Lawrence and says with a smile that life is a funny thing, after which he says with a malicious smile that he was put in an opponent with him, and this time it will be lying at his feet. After that, the instructor, closing his eyes and tying his hands, says that the exam is not evaluated by victory, and the main criterion is how successfully they have put into practice the knowledge they have gained. And he says that he also asks you to refrain from deadly attacks, after which he says that the exam has begun, and the opponents have rushed into battle. Abruptly attacks Lawrence, lunging forward. He calls him a pathetic coward, and he barely defends himself from the force of the blow. He continues to stab at the man's sword while he defends himself in a way that will not be good for him. He smiles and tries to swing from above, after which it hits him squarely on the head, and Lawrence, looking at the way the gun heals on him, says that this is the end. He recalls Romany telling him that he should make it clear to them in the exam what happens when you look down on them. After that, he says that a man named Lawrence Dimitri. He lands a low kick, hitting it squarely on the chin and sending it flying. He says that he is a bad person and his chin is burning red. He gritted his teeth. And at this point, Lawrence also gritted his teeth, goes ahead and says that you need to keep this attitude, and he will prove his importance to everyone. He remembers Roman and says that he will become like him. He continues to attack, throwing blow after blow, and the enemy begins to retreat under a barrage of the same blows. He steps back and tries to swing, saying look at him. He lunges forward with a serious and angry face and says that he is too. But he misses with a punch because Lawrence was able to dodge and hits him under the shoulder. Lawrence starts screaming and makes a punch too, saying that he is also Dimitri. He aims his punch straight at the man's head. Then he wakes up. The instructor tells him with his eyes closed that he was on the verge of death. Lawrence gets to his knees, looking at the instructor in surprise, and the instructor tells him that the moment William's attack hit him, he avoided a direct hit. He remembers how Lawrence was able to avoid a direct hit and hit back. If he hadn't suddenly dodged, he probably wouldn't be talking to him right now. After that, the instructor looks at him and smiles and says that nevertheless, he did a good job today, and after watching him all this time, he never thought that he had no talent. He remembers Lauren standing with her sword, trembling and clearly terrified. Speaking of which, he just always got scared in his head and started shaking. Therefore, he still couldn't reach his full potential, and that he has asked for sparring sessions that are on today's exam. He paired him with William, remembering how William looks so much more serious than Lawrence when he's shaking. After all, he believes that he should overcome it. After that, he looks at him, is very surprised and, not understanding, raises his head and says that really he is serious. She says that he would not deceive the student. He needs to believe in himself more, after which Lawrence begins to cry, squeezing his mouth, and he is told that he is stronger than the same William. Therefore, he should not give in to fear in advance. Lawrence is on his knees, bowing to the instructor, who looks down at him and tells him that if he lets his spirit break, there's nothing he can do. After that, William is shaking and sweating all over, gritting her teeth and getting angry while his friends try to calm him down. He says damn his blue-haired friend, tells him to calm down. As long as the brown-haired man reaches out to him, clearly worried, and says what's right, first of all he has to pull himself together. William is very angry. He lowers his head, burns all over and says that he was too soft with him. So he was emboldened, recalling how he was attacked. He says that now he dares to look at him with such a look. He turns to his acquaintances with anger, saying that he will not let this go, and this boy should lose at least an arm. His friends are very scared of him and worried. The blue-haired one says that he is really ready to go so far. The other is also very worried that he does not know that his older brother Roman Dimitri, nicknamed Heroes of Our Country. For the way he looks, if something goes wrong, it will escalate into a family conflict. Then he turns around in all his anger and, lowering his head, says that yes, he does not know him. He is the eldest son of the Castro family, and what will they do against him? He remembers his father, the red-haired one, smiling as he shakes hands with Baron Benedict. And no matter what he did in Cairo, he shouldn't be touched, because they wouldn't dare. He is pitiful as well as angry, smiling. Looking ahead says that the hero of the country he is there, or who, he will show that his bloodline is ultimately nothing before the true power. He goes up to his friends, and while they are looking at him in agitation, he says that immediately bring Lawrence Dimitri to him. If he resists, he must knock him out. After that, Roman stood at the door, watching the whole thing. They ask him, let him repeat it. Once again they watch him. He is dressed in a black robe with purple details, and he tells them that, let him say again that he was going to make him a little brother. After that, his friends, looking at Roman, were very scared, looking at him and trembling as he stood further away. He says that if he wants it that way, then he will say so. After that, Roman grabs him by the neck and pushes him away, saying that if he shows that his origin is nothing before the true authority. Roman lifts him over his head as he grabs his arm, trying to pull it away as he is being strangled. And Romana says that he understands what a mistake he just made. A friend who was standing in front was very surprised at how quickly Roman got here. Roman holds him up with one hand while he crosses himself and tries to get out, saying that if he's bullying his brother, it's okay. After that, he squeezed his neck even harder and says that the trouble is that his words reached him, and he heard everything, and how he mocked his brother and how he mocked the Dimitri family. After that, Roman, embittered, looking at them, said that they dared to humiliate his family. They let him out, taking his hand away and telling him that he should lead him to his family right now. He falls to his knees, clutching his neck, and his eyes are red with fear. He starts to rest and asks him what. Roman Zielobelna, who has covered himself with mana, says that if the son who is not his own made a mistake, then isn't his fault shifted to the parents responsible for your son's behavior. He looks at it and says he wants to hold what is really true power. After that, events are transferred to his castle. It's getting dark. Someone asks, it turns out that all attempts were justified. It was Count Fabius. He, dressed in a business suit, says that he really gave them a chance to return to their career, but they could not give a sensible assessment. They say that's why they hate dealing with commoners. A man with yellow hair is sitting there, smiling, sipping a crumb of tea and saying that he is always pathetic and does not allow them to break up what they are saying right in front of their noses, that the Count must be patient. It was a faction of the aristocracy, Count Castro. Let me put the cup on the table and says that, by the way, is Roman Dimitri really such an outstanding warrior? To which Fabio replies that it goes without saying. Otherwise he wouldn't have made Marquis Benedict risk his life to win him over to his side. Plus, looking at him, looking away and covering his face with his hand, he says that since this is Count Castro, he will tell you in confidence that the Marquis considers Roman as his son-in-law. He is surprised. They say that this is how he begins to smile and get angry. They say that it was necessary to meet him personally somehow. Let him arrange meetings for them if he gets the chance later. Then someone knocks and Count Cairo knocks. He is surprised by this, not saying that what is the matter. His son comes to him or calls for his father, and they are both surprised by this. They see behind his back while he says that Roman Dimitri came in. William, putting his hand on his chest, shouts with joy that he really heard how Dimitri's novel treated him, because he is a pathetic commoner, and he dared to threaten his eldest son Castro. After which, Count Castro is very surprised, looking at Roman, and thinking to himself that the curse. He shouts that they need to shut him up right now, standing right in front of his son. And he is very surprised by this and is afraid. They say that the father. Count Castro grabs him by the back of his cape and lifts him up, shouting in his face that he knows who he's hit. And this is Mr. Roman, the heroes who saved their country. He throws his son on the floor, and he walks away. Speaking of which, how dare he slander a great person? He bends down in front of Roman and says to him, asking for forgiveness, that his careless son caused him inconvenience. As he tries to get up, he keeps saying that he will be punished, and he will go through educational work so that this does not happen again, so he asks for mercy. He starts to smile and holds up his hands, saying that if you don't have a moment, would you like to have a cup of tea? I think, to myself, that this is all he needs. Castro smiles very sarcastically, and looks at Roman, thinking to himself that he didn't think that the chance to establish ties with Roman would come so soon, and he wouldn't reject such an apology. To which Roman, looking at him seriously, says, what is this supposed to mean? After all, accepting an apology or not is up to him, not you. Roman, looking at the Count, tells him that his son has created problems affecting the Dimitri family, and for a long time he has been hounding his brother Lawrence. And right in front of him, she said she was going to break his arm. To which Roman, with a serious face, says that as soon as the words come out of his mouth, they gain power, and he cannot close his eyes to the current situation. Whereupon the Count stood looking at Roman, holding out his hand, and said what he was offering him to do, break his son's arm. He puts on a serious face, lowering his head, and says that let them think ahead and try to find a rational solution to what he should do. After that, William stands between influence and fear, looking at the current situation, and Roman tells him that let him find his brother Lawrence, and kneel in front of him in front of everyone to ask him for forgiveness. And Roman, having calmed down, looks at the Count and says that he will also have to leave the Royal Academy. After all, he doesn't want his brother to breathe the same air as garbage. But if he is not satisfied with this situation, he will not refuse to fight. After that, the Count, very frightened and angry, looks at Roman, showing his displeasure, and Roman continues to say that whether he will join the war with his family or agree to his proposal. After which, he tells him loudly that the choice is up to him as Count Castro. The Count turns away from him, walking back to his desk and thinking about what should he do? He decides to speak up and tells him that this is why rootless mutts are a headache. Or maybe the Marquis had noticed him. He immediately decided that he was at least of some value. He walks right up to Roman, poking him with his finger, and starts yelling at him, what is this nonsense? He won't be the tip of Castro's fingernail. And for that matter, it will show him the strength of the aristocracy and the central government-owned one. After that, the Count starts looking at Fabius, who is drinking tea, and Fabius notices this. The Count says that he has been observing the situation from the very beginning, and he asks to witness everything that happened to the Marquis. The Count is very angry with everything that is happening, and, gritting his teeth, shouts that he should tell him that Roman has crossed the line and he has nothing left but to pass the appropriate punishment. Fabius brings a cup of tea to him and hesitantly says that how can he explain all this more gently. Speaking of which, isn't it obvious that it's William's fault? After that, the Count, looking at Fabius, is very surprised at what is happening and begins to worry. I ask him what happened and why he thinks so. He recalls that among the aristocracy, Fabius had a nickname for Cairo's raccoon, imagining him as a raccoon. They remember all the other aristocrats and what makes him stand out, saying that although the world is full of people with extraordinary ability, in fact, people like Fabius survive to the end. I remember the way his eyes shone, and he said that he could read the situation from all sides, and when he made deals with profitable people, making useful connections with the family line, he was nothing like that. Real government. And the Count remembers walking with the young Marquis Benedict. As an earl and descended from a prominent clan, he had established a friendly relationship with Marquis Benedict from a young age. And Fabius, watching the situation and the scandal, looking at the novels, thinks to himself that the problem is that his opponents have become Roman Dimitri. And he thinks that, although it is more accurate to side with Castro, but for the sake of victory, the Marquis will abandon even a close friend. He spins a lot of gears in his head, thinking that the only exception is blood relations. Thinking that the Marquis has been trying so hard lately to make romances his son-in-law, and in that case, the answer is the same. After that, Fabio puts his tea on the table and tells him that Count Castro, if his child has made a mistake in something, then it is better not to hide this shame, but to give him the appropriate punishment. After which, Count Castro was very surprised by what was happening, thinking to himself that it was a curse and opening his mouth. He thinks of Fabio as he looks at him and thinks to himself that he is Cairo's raccoon and that he has calculated everything. While he smiles and gives some kind of sinister aura, he thinks that he is sure that he has made up his mind that he will benefit from staying on Dimitri's side. If a war breaks out with the names of Dimitri's family, they will be thrown into hell, remembering how their estate will be destroyed, breaking like glass. Very afraid of this, I started to worry and lose. After which, he leans in, thinking to himself that he can't make things worse out of pride. He begins to apologize and says that after listening to Count Fabius, he realized that he made a mistake. He continues to stand bent over Roman, and Roman stares at it all while Roman says what he's asking him to do. Sorry, anyway, this is his son's business, and he lost his sanity for a moment. After which, William is surprised by everything and shouts to him that the father. Roman stands and thinks to himself that aristocrats always mistakenly believe that they have the upper hand, and now that he has abruptly rushed to the top, that the probability that his family will suffer damage is also due to jealousy and envy. Looking at the whole situation from above, she somehow apologizes to him. He says that's why he needs to show a good example at least once, and it wouldn't be so bad if it was Count Castro. Then the Count, leaning forward with his eyes closed, says that he will obey the words of Mr. Roman. He orders his son to apologize to his brother and leave the Royal Academy, whereupon William stands in bewilderment and fears. They say that how can a father do this? Roman smiles and hears him tell him that he needs to understand his father's heart. Then, turning around and leaving while he is still standing bent over, he says that he will consider it fine that the issue is settled. After that, the Count says goodbye, that he thanks him for his mercy. And William stands annoyed, turns around and realizes that Roman is leaving, with a surprised look. He thinks to himself what kind of person he touched as he looks at Roman's back as he walks out of the building. Then someone calls out to Lawrence, who turns around in surprise. They tell him that things are bad. He remembers that he is one of William's gang and has blue hair. A blue-haired man shouts to him that his brother Roman Dimitri got involved in a conflict with William, and William got angry, pro Count, and he said he would break his arm. But brother Roman also heard it. William was very surprised by this. Being afraid, they ask, "How is it?" Blue hair, the guy is surprised, pointing his finger, says that after that William quarreled with his brother, and he dragged him to go straight to his father Count Castro. Lawrence runs to him saying that his brother thinks to himself that so far Count Castro is more than capable of killing his brother, and this time he may be in danger. Lawrence is very scared and runs forward with his mouth open, thinking to himself that if his brother gets hurt because of him, he will never be able to forgive himself for it. Gritting her teeth, starting to cry. After that, when he comes to the communication room, he asks what is the matter, and he weeping says that he was told that his brother is in danger. He loses his tears, stood near the crystal and says that he intervened to help him. On the other hand, the father and his wife are surprised to hear him being taken to the Castro estate. After that, the Baron slams a strong fist on the table and says that these bastards are Castro. The Baron begins to tremble, gritting his teeth, thinking to himself that he is trying to avoid making unnecessary calls and is afraid of causing inconvenience. But even if he calls with tears in his eyes, something has definitely happened. Then he turns to his wife and tells her what he should do while she stands by him. He says that she knows the Castro family because they are part of the central government and are in close relations with the Marquis Benedict. To which she shouts that why does it only concern him? She clutches her chest and shouts that now their eldest son Roman is in danger. She calms down, lowering her hands and bowing her head, telling the Baron that relations with the central government will be considered later. Barono lowered his head and closed his eyes, and she keeps saying that the Dimitri family isn't that weak. Then he stands up and hugs her, saying thank you for her words. He stretches out his hand, standing next to his wife, who is smiling at his back, and he shouts that they should immediately call the family's vassals together. After all, no one will dare to refuse. After which, sitting at a table with all the vassals gathered, he says that his eldest son of the Dimitri family faced danger due to disagreements with the Castro family. He goes on to say that, based on information about Lawrence, the last thing he saw was him being taken to the Castro estate. And all the vassals, very frightened, were surprised at what was happening, looking at the Baron. And he goes on to say that even though their opponent is Castro from the central government, he is not going to be self-taught to sit on the sideline, looking at all the vassals who look at him and worry. So he needs their consent. He looks around, worried, and thinks to himself that maybe he will face some serious resistance. After that, one of the men raises his hand, and it turns out to be the captain of the Night Order Dimitri, Jonathan. He says that he agrees by looking at others. He throws up his hands and goes on to say that it is dangerous to speak out against members of the central government, but this is not about anyone, but about the firstborn, the Dimitri family. Remembering all your soldiers, how they all stand and say that they are willing to give their lives to protect the young master. And the head of blacksmithing, Hendrik, raising his fist and saying that the head he immediately launched all the Dimitri blacksmith, because how many weapons will be needed for the war. After which, he claps under the dining room, says that young master Roman is the future Dimitri, and whoever the opposite family about her will forgive them for touching the young master. After that, all the vassals, unskilled blacksmiths and miners of the spring, as well as ordinary residents of their families, none of them will oppose his choice. After that, the Baron sits with a serious face and thinks to himself that everyone is filled with such determination for the sake of Dimitri, thinking that their family has always chosen peace. But from now on, they will act as the lords of the north of the eastern lands. After that, many people hear rumors that this is true. The people of Shakti explain that the scoundrels dared to touch the hero of their family. And the head of Iron Mountain, Jacob, shouts that he will immediately gather all the miners, and even if they can't fight, they will help others prepare everything necessary for the war. After that, Morgan is responsible for security, also raising his hands and shouting that the damned aristocrats of the capital have made an attempt on the life of Mr. Roman, and they must increase the volume of production, even if they have to forget about sleep. And many workers began to work in their forges. They have sped up and say that the sooner they don't finish the case, the sooner the young master can return home. After that, everyone with the head of the forge works at full capacity, shouting that forget about rest for the sake of the young master, continuing to forge weapons. After that, their whole family began to work very hard, because everyone who lived under their family, Dimitri, threw all his strength to save one person, and in less than an hour, the work began to boil in full swing. Roman comes out of the manor, smiling. And it is said that no one in the capital could have imagined a bomb while Lawrence was biting his fingers and trembling in fear. After all, they dropped Dimitri. Lawrence comes out of the calm room in a hurry. He thinks to himself that he has contacted his father, and he will definitely send people to help. He runs forward with a lot of excitement, thinking about what to do until then, because he doesn't think about finding his older brother in the first place. After which, many people gathered in one place in gray and green uniforms. They are discussing something fiercely and are worried, and in time as thinks to himself, why are there so many people crowded here? And then it dawns on him, he sees Roman. Roman, taking the offender by the scruff of the neck, carries him forward while he tries to get out, closing his eyes. After that, Roman shouts, "That's where you're, Lawrence," and throws the offender to him. He gets down on one knee, and Roman is standing next to him, telling him to apologize. A huge crowd gathered around. Lauren, watching this, is all surprised by Roman Bridge that if he can't, then his family will pay in full instead of him. And then the Baron runs in and shouts to William to do it quickly, very worried. After which, William grits his teeth and closes his eyes, bows his head and tells Lawrence about what. Let him apologize for all the time he bullied him, and he suffered because of his whim. He leans forward and closes his eyes, saying that's why he's sorry, so please let him see them. He would leave the academy and never appear in front of him again. Lauren stands there in shock, her mouth hanging open in surprise, not understanding what's going on or what this is all about. The Count is very worried and in a panic shouts at Lawrence to please accept his apology. and he promises that it won't happen again. He also approaches and bows to Lawrence, saying that he's genuinely sorry. After that, they go out on the balcony, where Roman tells Lawrence what happened. And the latter is surprised and bends down, looks at Roman Lawrence and asks him, "Brother Roman, how did he manage to do this?" And Roman tells him to listen carefully. It wasn't just for his sake that he was in the way today. He turns to look at the views and says that they insulted the Dimitri family and he, as their representative, I felt that it was necessary to put him in his place. Lawrence listens in silence to Roman, who turns to him and says that if they continue to mock him, they made him bow his head. People would start belittling his authority and their families, to which the ugly man hesitates and, bending down, apologizes to Roman, who tells him to raise his head. Roman looks at Lawrence with a serious face and says his name, in their family Dimitriev, and he wishes his little brother wouldn't have to go through that again. And he says that he should understand what his strength is and what he can do next, remembering what Roman himself decided to do to raise the rank. Lawrence listens to Roman in surprise, looking at him, and Roman goes on to say that if Castro had known how powerful their family was from the start, he wouldn't have been able to treat him so lightly. I call him little brother. After that, London, loaded with his brother's words. He presses his hand to his chest and says that, yes, he will remember his words, and he will not allow himself to be offended again. Roman smiles, looks at him and says that it's true. He also doesn't want to be cannon fodder in the fight between brothers anymore. After which, Lawrence gets it and says that damn, he was really scared and tells his brother that he needs to contact his family immediately. Otherwise, Dad will definitely arrange something. Why does the Baron beat William? I call him an insignificant. The Baron continues to yell at him, while William grabs his cheek with one hand, which he slapped, and he shouts that this brat is his own son, and even though he realizes what a mistake he made today, he remembers the entire aristocracy, and the fact that Roman is the deity of Cairo, because he is the strongest kingdom and everyone has lost their way to win him over to their side. Remembering only the team, confidently goes. And he shouts that he has harmed his younger brother, and at the very moment when he is the eldest son of the caste will bend the knee. William begins to be very afraid, clearly frightened, moves away. The Baron points at him and continues to shout that the prestige of their family has fallen to the ground. And he says that from now on, in the eyes of people, they will become idiots, unable to understand the true state of affairs. Whereupon the Baron clutches his head, saying what the hell, and thinks to himself, what, as he is now pointing at the Marquis Benedict's eyes. After that, one of the servants runs in, shouting to the Baron that a magic signal has arrived from the Dimitri family. He doesn't turn around, doesn't understand what is happening, and shows obvious surprise. Thinks where is the signal from them? After that, the Baron moved to the communication room, where the head of the Dimitri family showed his projection and said, Count Castro, what cannot be? The aristocrats of the central government may not take them seriously, but they dared to touch the native blood of the Dimitri family. After that, the Count, very frightened, looks at all this, and he thinks to himself what is going on, because he is already on edge. And why did Baron Romanov again raise the issue that had already been resolved? To which the head of the Dimitri family shouts at him, raising his hand, that tomorrow at dawn they will submit a request for a feudal war to the central government. From this point on, the Dimitriev Trade Guild freezes all shipments related to countries, showing that all paths to them and getting gold are cut off. After all, they will get all the Castro bonds left in the gold bank. After that, the Count is very afraid of everything that is happening and continues to listen to the Baron that for the enemy, preparing for war and money, there are significant threats. But that's not all. And he says that he has contacted all the forces at war with Castro. Show them, and the fact that the head of the Dimitri family sent a person to contact everyone, and they are all ready to cooperate with them in the war, by investing huge amounts of money in the war, among other things. After which, the Baron goes on to say that he will tell them to use any means and ends. And the Count stands in shock, looking up at the top and not knowing what to do, because the Baron says that they are ready to crush the Castro family. And no matter what price Dimitri pays for it, he says with confidence that they will destroy their family at all costs. After that, the Count stands, he starts to stagger, and he understands what is happening, says that this cannot be allowed. And Mstislav grits his teeth, thinking to himself that there is no mercy in his words. And Roman Dimitri, his father's son. The Baron continues to say, looking at Castro, that since he is warning for the last time, let his son go now. And the Count stands in shock, not understanding. The Count raises his hands and starts shouting to Harrow that they are deeply mistaken right now, and they are not holding anyone from the Dimitri family. Because the problem with Lawrence is also solved, because his son William was on his knees asking for his forgiveness, about how it happened and what kind of war he talks about, after which the Baron starts to worry and says, that's how it is. And the Count is very worried about the whole flow, says that yes, it is. They've already talked to Roman and decided everything. They'll be careful not to let this happen again. And the Baron starts to switch off, says it's fine. After that, the communication crystal is turned off. The Count, leaving, thinks that he is a natural leader, starting with the top blacksmiths and ending with the miners of Narodniki. The Baron goes out on the balcony, where a huge number of people have gathered. And to some extent, Roman completely captured the hearts of the Dimitri people, remembering how all the family heads came together, looking at the defense with confidence in their eyes, talking about when he had grown up like this. The Baron stretches out his hand from the balcony and shouts to everyone that the war is cancelled. Right now, they should be preparing for the banquet. He shouts to everyone that they can eat as much as they want, drink as if it's their last day. And all the people standing at the bottom and looking at the Baron are shouting with happiness. After that, in one of the buildings, people discuss what happened. It is said that they have seen for themselves, however, that Count Castro is one of the most powerful men in the capital. And he made the eldest son get down on his knees and apologize to the third son, Dimitri. After which, sipping a mug of beer, the man says that the tooth gives the power system to Cairo change it. He says that even though it didn't last more than a couple of hours, but many merchants decided that the merchants and employees of the Dimitri Trade Guild had declared that they were ready to break all deals with the family. Castro, approaching one of the Castro family's men and saying that they will not work with them. After that, the man, smiling, says that he understands what this means, because the Dimitri family was planning to start a war with the Castro family. A lot of people are discussing what's going on and saying that the provincial family is against the Castro family. One of the men, smiling, says that this is even more frightening, and people passing nearby are watching it all. They say that as soon as everything happened, large amounts of investment poured into the Dimitri family, showing that the Dimitri family had a lot of money, removing Castro from the money. And Lucas says that they felt that in the confrontation between the capital and the professional family, Dimitri has a better chance of winning. They are dressed in ordinary clothes, not knightly ones. He smiles and says all these words. After all, this case completely changed the position of Dimitri. After that, Roman sits in his room on a chair and drinks tea. He closes his eyes, holds up his mug, and thinks to himself that the Dimitri family denies wars, but they made this decision for him. Then he looks into the mug and thinks that this is not the Baron's sole choice. His father. This is possible only with the consent of the key figures forming in their family. He remembers the Dimitri estate and says that a small society called Dimitri has settled on the outskirts. They were ready to go to war to save him. He remembers himself and asks for life and says that the life of a heavenly demon was spent under the aegis, surviving the strongest and in a world where everything was allowed. Remembering how he stood in the blood and watched something, he had seen many deaths, which radically changed his character. After which, he says that he is drinking tea while smiling. He thinks that this life is different from the last one. The kingdom of Hector. Out in the fog and dark, Jackson and the other knight cried out to the prince, "Is he awake?" He wakes up all wrapped up in bandages and badly wounded. He is very surprised at what is happening and talks about how long he was unconscious, remembering how Roman on the battlefield ran forward and cut down all the knights. After all, he is an amazing creature named Roman Dimitri, and if he had the ability to turn back time, he could completely crush. After which, Edwin is in some form, glowing with something green. He says that no, this is impossible. There's a look of incomprehension and fear on his face. He watches as Roman crushes his knights by slashing them. And he thinks about the fact that he didn't break Hector's deepest depths of despair with his own hands. He looks down on the many bloodied knights lying there, thinking that if he hadn't started the war, he might have bought more time to prolong the kingdom's existence. And instead of it, he put everyone under the knife. He grits his teeth as he watches and thinks to himself that because of him, Hector has faced a better course of action, and from now on, he must do everything to find a way to save his country. He looks down as many bloody hands reach for him, and he thinks that as long as there are people, through the gaze, he is turned only to him. His eyes start to burn, and he says that he can't just give up, because he is. Then he wakes up and sees the faces of Jason and the other knight, who are surprised to shout at him, "What, is the prince really awake?" And then Shok, opening his eyes, realizes what is happening and asks how long he slept. They show him his palace and tell him that he slept for about a week, and even though everyone involved in the war bit their tongues, the news transmitted from Cairo sent the entire Hector kingdom into despair. A lot of people leave, all beaten and hungry, and they think that the demon Cairo single-handedly slaughtered 1,000 soldiers, but that's not all. He even wounded Captain Butler, and the fact that this battle was obviously lost. Many passers-by look down in excitement and realize that they are like frogs in a well. And the man with the golden hair says that this world is teeming with monsters that they don't even know about. After that, the king sits in the throne room and Edwin, sitting on one knee, approaches him. The king tells him how he feels, and Edwin says he's fine. A gray-haired king with scars. He stands up straight, lowering his head and saying that he is a stupid boy, even though he has handed over the matter of the royal family to him, because of the lack of abilities. But he didn't expect to solve the problem at the cost of his own son's life. Then Edwin sighs, closing his eyes and apologizing to him. He quickly looks at the king and asks his father if he heard Jackson's report. He answers that he has heard, and they remember that in the village of Hector, which began a crop failure due to a strange anomaly, the earth turned black and all living things died out with understanding everything as if it were a wasteland. And, apparently, they're looking at the fact that it was a skeleton man with a book in his hands and the necromancer's curse is involved. The king is horrified, standing and looking up. He remembers that the necromancer is walking down a road dotted with purple, a mass of copper or eyes floating out of it. Everything around him is burnt, and a dark aura surrounds him. And it's possible that the crop failure spewing Hector all this time was sent deliberately. Moreover, the entire territory of Hector was affected, which means that it was not without black magic spreading in the territory for several years. Remembering how everything burns dark floating on the map and shows that it was Hector. After that, the king, very surprised, frightened, asks him, saying that in other words, there is a force that was just waiting for them to attack Cairo. Edwin replies that, yes. He looks at the king and says that this force was hiding in the shadows and deliberately ignited a war between the two kingdoms for its own benefit. The king is horrified, lowering his eyes and says that the curse that has spread throughout the kingdom could be that. Only the Great Reaper can do it, but they don't have the strength left. After that, Edwin recalls how he was still small and stood next to a man who was being patted on the head. Doesn't say that as a child. The master of the Sky Tower also offered to give him whatever he wanted. And little Edwin, smiling, I say, what if he hides from the title of prince and devotes his life to the magic tower? Edwin raises his hand and says that he will sell his time to the heavenly magic tower, to which the king stands up very much, panicking and shouting his name. With a serious face, Edwin tells the king that he only needs a year, and this is the only way that can solve the problem. After that, the man drops the mug on the table, hitting it. He, clearly intoxicated, sits and looks at this mug and thinks that if he is destined to die, then he wants to do it on the battlefield. He gritted his teeth and lowered his head, wondering to himself if there would be room for a lone swordsman. And this is hardly the reality. After that, a man comes up to him and says that they haven't seen each other for a long time, and the latter, surprised, turns around. It was a novel, and he smiles and says he'll ask directly. Had he ever considered joining the Dimitrians under his wing? After that, this drunk soldier turns around and thinks to himself, why would Mr. Roman do this? He kneels in front of him and says that he is sincerely grateful for everything offered by closing his eyes. But as he sees it, he only has one hand. He thinks to himself, very worried and gritting his teeth, that he wants to agree, but he is no longer valuable as a swordsman, and yet he doesn't want to responsibly offer, and really, he doesn't want to refuse and doesn't want to refuse. And he tells Roman that what can such a person do for him, because he is completely useless as a swordsman and is afraid that he will only drag him down. Roman smiles and looks down at him, saying that why does that sound like a rejection to him, or is he wrong? The swordsman is surprised by this and listens to Roman. Thoth says Thoth has ever heard of a left-handed sword. Roman recalls his past with the left-handed swordsman Song Beat. This is a man with long hair, wrapped in a sheet and swords in his left hand walking forward. He served the imperial family, but devoted himself to the country, losing an arm in the war. Remembering that the palace recognized his many years of merit, and rewarded him with wealth and fame, giving him a lot of money in the chest. But he, who had spent his entire life on the battlefield, couldn't accept a peaceful life. He stands on the slope of one of the mountains and says that he made the decision to leave the path of a soldier, even if it leads to a miserable end. After that, he trains with one hand, hitting wood. Speaking of which, he devoted many years to sword training and left arm training without adapting to the new living conditions. After that, he began to challenge other warriors to a duel, using the left-handed sword he created. He cut down many opponents with his sword and disturbed the balance of his body, which was always perceived as his weakness. He, on the contrary, artificially turned to his advantage and used it in attack. Because of many wars, they were killed by his blade. He remembers himself as Shah beside him, even though his last opponent was Taki, Roman, who stuck a sword in his body, and he fell to his knees and sat. He remembers that he was killed by someone and met his death. Roman then snaps back to reality, and says with a smile that if he follows him, he will tell him about the left-handed sword technique. And the same one, continuing to watch, he says that he promises to make sure that it will bring him benefits and more than anyone else. After which, this soldier looks very surprised and thinks to himself that he can bring benefit. And sure enough, this man, his savior, he remembers being with many soldiers in Roman's group, and if only he could live the life of a non-one-armed Kolka, do whatever it takes. After that, he sits down on one knee in front of Roman and says that it is enough for him to say that he has done him good. He stands in front of Roman, who looks at him, smiles, and says that from now on, he has dedicated his entire life to the master. And on that day, he found a new hope. After that, the bloody sword standing on the ground around the wall was all bloody, and the entire floor around it was also covered in blood. The war changed the lives of many people. Edwin, Hector, McBurney, and even remembering how sloppy the king of the Albert Henry family, leading many soldiers of the villagers on horseback. They were all caught up in the maelstrom of change. Legends looks at the sky and thinks to himself sadly that Mr. Roman is so cruel, and after all they went through the war together. He sighs, thinking that he might as well take it. After which, he says that it is still better to live among people who treat him with respect. After that, he says that it's fine. He thinks that it's enough that he was released from the service. He goes to the gate and sees many signs where he is called the hero of Cairo and congratulates him on his return, because he is the proud son of the Albert family. Henry did nothing about the war with Hector, but many townspeople and people greeted him with honors, shouting his name. But the mere fact that he was on the battlefield with Roman was enough to change his status completely. Then he looks at it all, smiling with sincere eyes. And a man with a huge gray beard and a hat gets in touch with him. He introduces himself as the Royal Academy of Cairo. He says if he could give a lecture about the war being bred in the South. To which Henry smiles and thinks to himself that this is the place to increase his value. He started teaching at the academy, thinking that he needed to tell everyone how great Dimitri was. Many students sat and listened to him as he talked about how praising the novel and playing the role of a mouthpiece would spread fame around the world. He was assiduous in saying that this moment was a turning point in the life of an idle aristocrat. And a few days later, Roman walked with his soldiers and many citizens shouted after them saying that happy road to him, and may he live. Even the king of High is thinking to himself when he will return to the capital again. Many nobles were watching him, and he would have to make a choice. Roman turns around, looking at them, and thinking that until then, the entire north of Vostochny will submit to his authority. He smiles and thinks so he can stand up to the central government. Roman, along with his warriors, was walking along the forest road. Suddenly, one of the warriors looked to his left, puzzled, and then stopped when he heard shouts that all the crops for this year were ruined. In front of Roman there were 3 men who were sitting in an empty field. They were shouting that this is a scoundrel. How can they feed their families now? Roman was riding a horse past them. He turned around and then asked who they were. Chris came up to him and came forward saying that it must be the farmers of the Dimitri family. Roman asked how Dimitri's people ended up on the Conrad lands. Chris, looking confidently at the novels, replied that there is not much land for cultivation on the territory of the city. Some residents borrowed land in Conrad to farm. Roman looked down and then thought about it. Suddenly, he turned to Chris and ordered him to bring these people to him. He must listen to them, what happened from beginning to end. The frightened cultivators came to Roman, and then the oldest of them nervously said that they had signed a contract with the Conrad family, borrowing land here for 10 years. The man's eyes filled with tears. He spread his hands, and then with a trembling voice continued to say that it would be time to harvest in a month, but the Conrad family announced that they would release the land in a week. The man continued to say that they were holding out, saying that they couldn't leave, but they sent people out, turning the land into a bare field. The Conrad family warriors on horseback trampled all the crops. The man, bursting into tears, shouted that young master, it's not fair if they can't harvest the crops. How can they continue to live? What can they eat? Chris anxiously turned to Roman and said, what happened to the peasants is sad, but they have no right to interfere in this matter. The land loaned by the farmers is entirely owned by the Conrad family, so this can cause conflict between the families. Chris looked at the thoughtful Roman, and then went on to say that the Conrad family, along with the other aristocrats of the northeastern lands, had formed an alliance. Northeast Alliance, a small alliance created by powerful families for their own benefit, where everyone covers for each other. Chris was afraid of Roman's response, that doing nothing would only make the problem worse. Roman gave Chris a murderous look and went on to say that they needed to root out the root of the problem before they felt permissive. Chris bowed to Roman, and then said that he obeys and obeys. If the master has made a decision, it is the duty of a subordinate to follow his will. Roman together with the knights entered the city. People celebrated, and shouted that Roman is the hero of Cairo. Roman waved amiably and smiled, and someone in the crowd shouted that Roman was the real pride of the Dimitri family. Roman entered Dimitri's palace. His mother and Romero met him. Romero spread his hands and shouted with a happy face that Roman should come to him. Romero, smiling broadly, hugged his son tightly, then shouted that Roman had done a great job. Roman calmly asked if his father had lived well. My father happily replied that otherwise, one would think that something special was going on in the Dimitri lands. Romero, looking at the happy Roman, said that he had prepared a grandiose score in his honor. Roman will eat enough today and let him drink as much as he can. Let him have fun properly. Roman glared at Romero and apologized to him, then asked if he could spare him a moment before doing so. We are taken to Romero's office, and he stands in front of Roman and says that he also heard about this. They have no way to stop the Conrad family from taking back their land. Romero sternly replies that if you interfere this time, in the future it will be very difficult for farmers to cultivate land on their territory. Roman looks at his father in fright and says that he thinks that if they were people in Benedict, Conrad would take the land of their peasants, as now. Hearing these words, Romero got into a stupor. And then, remembering Marquis Benedict, he said that he was the living embodiment of power. No one would even dare to think of touching the Marquis and his people. Roman asked that in this case, in Romero's opinion, what place do they occupy in the northeast? Romero, puzzled, asked, the family is Dimitri. And then he said that he was pretty sure that now that the Barcos were destroyed, there wasn't a single family stronger than them in the northeast. Romero, looking sternly at Roman, who clenched his fist, replied that he did not deny his words, but did not see the need to distribute an insignificant problem, setting up a local union against you. Roman calmly replied to his father that this is not so, there is a need. Roman's brow furrowed, and then he added that the real power was in Dimitri's hands, but the aristocracy, including the Conrad family, was showing off their idleness. After all, Dimitri is just one of their family, and if they are not protected by the central government, as they were with Barco, they do not see them as a threat. The Conrad family made a rash decision, daring to touch the residents of the city. And then Roman asked Romero if he understood what Roman was driving at. Roman raised his hand from a menacing look and said that for them Dimitri is the strongest family in the northeast only in words. Romero looked at Roman with a puzzled expression, and Roman went on to say that it was time to organize the hierarchy. Roman looked at his father with a crazy smile, and then said that they should make it clear to them who is on top, who is on the bottom. We are transported into the late evening, Romero holding a glass of wine in his hand. He remembers Roman saying fiercely that they had the power and an excuse to help their people, so why should they just stand by and watch the Conrad family mistreat their people? Romero remembered Roman's frantic face, which he held lightly with his hand, and his request to be given authority, and his words that all he had to do was make a decision, and Roman himself would bathe his hands in blood. Romero, sitting at the table, closed his eyes and sighed heavily, then said that his son had grown too much. He remembered that as a child, Roman had had to experience every hardship of life together with him, commoners. People called Roman a semi-noble, but perhaps it was the pain that made him what he is now. Romero looked down into his wine glass and saw his reflection. He thought again that this was true. Right now the family was not lacking. They were in strength, but in the determination of their master. Sitting at the table, Romero said that now it was his turn to take matters into his own hands. A new era had arrived. A few days later, a grand banquet was held in Moscow to celebrate Roman's return, and all the nobles of the northeastern lands gathered in Dimitri. A huge number of nobles would greet Roman, who was dressed in an expensive purple suit. The butler would announce that the Bolt family had arrived. Someone would approach Roman and say that she was Sophia from the Grizzle family. The person next to Roman would say that he had arrived to congratulate him on behalf of the Herat family. Roman communicated with the girl. She covered her mouth with her hand and laughed, although they did not recognize the Dimitri family as dominant, but nevertheless they did not deny its influence. Roman was approached by a girl in a purple dress who straightened her hair and asked in embarrassment if Roman accidentally remembered her. Roman replied that Mrs. Sophia from the Grizzle family, of course he remembers. Roman smiled and then asked her what they had said at the last banquet. Sophia happily replied that Roman actually remembered it. Sophia, looking normal, looked happy and confused. She thought that in fact, Roman is not what he was before. It would be perfect for her to marry such a man. Suddenly, a man approached Roman and bowed his head, saying that he was Viscount Conrad and it was a great honor for him to welcome the hero Cairo, who had repelled Hector's attack. Roman stared at him with particular interest, then wondered if this was what Viscount Conrad looked like, and then said that he was Roman Dimitri at his service. In front of us is a plump, middle-aged man with a small mustache under his nose. He is dressed in expensive clothes. This person is the Viscount of the Conrad family. Then he spreads his hands and says that he heard that in this battle, Roman defeated the 5-star swordsman Butler. Viscount Conrad turns to Roman and says that he really can't believe that he achieved such heights at such a young age. Roman replies that Viscount Conrad is exaggerating. People from different families crowded around Roman and Viscount Conrad listening carefully. Viscount Conrad said that in all the time, no one from the northeastern lands had ever been ranked in the ranking of rankers, but he thinks that Roman can aim for the very top. Roman glared at Viscount Conrad and said that, by the way, he had a personal question. Viscount Conrad, still smiling, reflected that the conversation was in a good mood, even though Roman was a commoner, but he was quite savvy. Then he told Roman to ask anything. Roman replied that he had heard that Viscount Conrad had unilaterally broken the contract with the tenants of the farm, taking away their arable land, and these words made Viscount Conrad raise an eyebrow to the heavens and look at Roman with a puzzled expression. People from different families were looking at what was happening in fear. Roman continued to say that he might ask what the reason was. Viscount Conrad started to get nervous, and then he said that a merchant guild had offered a better price, that's all, for these lands, and then he asked them to keep their conversations from you. Roman smiled, then asked if that was the only reason. Viscount Conrad was nervous but controlled, and then he told Roman that they were here to enjoy Roman's celebration. So why did Roman decide to bring up such a sensitive issue? Viscount Conrad looked around and then raised his voice to say that he had come with good intentions to congratulate Mr. Roman on his return. So why was he trying to blacken his good name in front of everyone present? Viscount Conrad turned away from Roman with a frown and said that with this attitude, he couldn't keep a smile on his face anymore. Viscount Conrad quickly headed for the exit, then said that he should let him take his leave, but Roman told him sternly stop. Roman the Stern looked in Viscount Conrad's direction and said that if he broke off the conversation now and left, Roman would regard this gesture as hostility towards the Dimitri family. Roman pointed a finger at his feet, then raised his voice and said that he would repeat, Viscount Conrad should come back to him. Viscount Conrad, hearing Roman's words, turned around with a frown and asked in an angry voice what he had just said. He ran up to Roman with his hand outstretched, then shouted that this is how he drove the peasants out of the land. But the land is entirely owned by his family. Viscount Conrad kept shouting furiously that he was getting his own back. Viscount Conrad glared at Roman, then added that either he had to report every little detail to Dimitri. Roman was already standing in front of Viscount Conrad. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. A whisper went around that Viscount Conrad was right. Baron Romero should have organized a meeting himself to resolve the conflict between the families. By what right does Roman bring this issue up for discussion? Besides, being so rude to the people gathered to congratulate him on his return. Viscount Conrad is the head of an entire family. He's not the type to be treated rashly, and Roman frowned, thinking that if it was a barge, they would react the same way. No, they would never allow that. The local aristocracy, located in the northeastern lands, is always ready to point a sword at the Dimitri family. Romanu kept the aristocrats on a leash in his mind. There are only two options, either put them all under the knife, or force them to obey their words. You should give them a clear choice. Roman looked down at the floor, then calmly said that he would ask directly, since when in the kingdom of Caire is it allowed to neglect the people of other nobles? Roman came up close and looked directly into Viscount Conrad's frightened eyes, then said that he had touched his peasants. His people, who live on Dimitri's lands, pay taxes in Dimitri's family, people who swore allegiance to Dimitri. Roman, looking at Viscount Conrad, raised his voice and said that even so, Viscount Conrad dares to mention a non-entity. Viscount Conrad looked at Roman confidently, but his face showed that he was very scared. Roman kept saying that Viscount Conrad hoped that Roman would smile and talk to him, even knowing that his people were hurt because of him. This issue has already been raised at the family meeting. Roman's father has given him absolute power, and he doesn't plan to turn a blind eye to this problem. Bacon Conrad gave Roman a startled look, then shouted, "What does that mean?" The aristocracy who heard this conversation was insanely tense and watched warily. Then Roman asked that Roman still wasn't going to apologize, then let everyone listen. Roman held out his hand to the side and then said that if in the future people from other possessions will settle on Dimitri's land, then he will ask them so much more. Roman smiled madly and then made a terrible suggestion. Let them check which of the diviners of it today will be able to say that this is an insignificant problem. The aristocracy was horrified, some of them wondering what the hell, if the words came true, they would be the ones who would suffer the losses. Viscount Conrad nervously reflected that Dimitri's novel, his skill, was not limited to swordsmanship. He turned out to be a real fox. Roman has set up a trap and is pushing them by force to prevent them from getting out. Viscount Conrad gave the aristocracy a startled look and thought that he wasn't going to back down now. This was the perfect time to join forces with the alliance. Suddenly, someone from the aristocracy said that this time it was Viscount Conrad's fault. This man was a Northeastern Alliance aristocrat we knew. Viscount Lawrence, who had complained that it was very important to maintain consistency when dealing with an issue. It was only for the people of the city, but Viscount Conrad had persecuted them without even informing his family. Viscount Lawrence held out his hand and said, "So let Viscount Conrad admit his mistake and apologize." Viscount Lawrence reflected that they didn't show any sympathy when Lawrence was confronted by Barco, the Northeast Alliance. So one name. Lawrence stepped forward in front of the aristocracy and stretched out his arms in different directions. "The Lawrences can live if they follow the family of Dimitri." He said that, "Ladies and gentlemen, they also think that Viscount Lawrence is right." Viscount Conrad watched dumbfounded as the aristocracy started to say that this was the case. Let Viscount Conrad immediately apologize to Mr. Roman. What kind of aristocrat could step over the situation with a smile? Viscount Conrad looked around in fright and wondered what the hell the Dimitri family's entourage was doing to corner them. Viscount Conrad bowed to Roman and considered that it would be best for him to retreat now, then said that he would be more careful in the future. We are taken to Romero's late-night office, where he is nervous, and then asks that he is sure that their flatness will not cause problems. Romero is confronted by Roman. Then Romero goes on to say that there is no way the Northeast Alliance will back down. Roman, frowning, replies that in order to organize the hierarchy once and for all, you need to force the opponent to exhaust all his strength. Only by rallying together and opposing Dimitri, trying to destroy them by all means. Roman held up his hand and then added that they would be able to feel the absolute powerlessness and accept the difference between them and the family and Dimitri. Only in this way would they be able to carry out their plan to the end. We are carried to the aristocrats who are sitting at the same table. One of them gets up and bangs his hand on the table, shouting to Viscount Conrad that Roman is an arrogant boy. Once everyone knew him as the fool of the Dimitri family, and now, as he has received recognition in the capital, he does not see beyond his own nose. The nobles indignantly shouted that it was true that his arrogance knew no bounds, while others discontentedly said that the lords, if they bowed their heads to him, people would no longer take the Northeastern Alliance seriously. Viscount Conrad frowned and said that it would be fine if they had a special way to solve this problem. All of a sudden, all the indignant nobles fell silent, then fell into thought. Viscount Conrad clasped his hands, then said that, to be honest, he was already questioning the meaning of the alliance's existence. Roughly speaking, the Dimitri family has an incomparably powerful army, and they also have a novel that defeated Butler. Viscount Conrad furrowed his brows and threatened to say that the usual methods can't handle them. One of the purple vest aristocrats raised his hand, then said, "How about we go to the central government?" Conrad asked him what he was suggesting to put pressure on the Dimitri family by the central government. After the collapse of Barco, they spent all their efforts to establish communication with them. It's time to capitalize on this. Viscount Conrad thought that it was true. They needed to use the central government to create favorable conditions for the Union. And then he said that then he would contact them right away. The entire Northeast Alliance, along with Viscount Conrad, gathered near the magic message. Viscount Conrad came forward, put his hand on his heart, smiling, and then said that Count Fabius, "Let me make a request to you," answered so that he could speak. A smiling man with long blue hair and a small mustache appears in front of us. Count Fabius, an aristocrat of the central government, who says that he cannot help but listen to the request of Viscount Conrad himself. Viscount Conrad smilingly replied, "Thank you for saying that," and then said with a frown that the fact was that they had recently had a disagreement with the Dimitri family. Viscount Conrad had asked Count Fabius to use the power of the central government to pressure them once. Viscount Conrad looked at the crystal with a puzzled expression. And then, turning around, he shouted to the butler that he couldn't even handle the connection. Count Fabius might be offended. Let them immediately connect to the connection. The butler replied in a frightened voice that he was listening. The connection was restored again. Count Fabius looked at Viscount Conrad with displeasure. Viscount Conrad nervously apologized, and then added that the connection was unstable. Fabius laughed, and then replied that it was necessary to be such a sharp eater. Viscount Conrad asked in a puzzled voice what. Count Fabius, furrowing his brows angrily, said that they poked Pose's ears on their outskirts. They asked to threaten Roman Dimitri. Viscount Conrad listened in dismay as Count Fabius said that Count Benedict cherished Roman like the apple of his eye, that he was doing his best to make him his son-in-law, and that they were talking nonsense about threats. The crystal that Count Fabius used to communicate with Viscount Conrad began to fade, and Count Fabius finally told them to stop suffering from garbage and better think about how to curry favor with Roman. Viscount Conrad was startled to think of a political marriage with the Marquis's daughter. One of the nobles nervously suggested that Viscount Conrad should apologize first. We are taken to Viscount Conrad, who is standing behind the crier, and the crier is announcing something to the crowd, and the conflict with the Conrad family is resolved. Viscount Conrad apologized to the cultivators and promised that he would not touch them until the end of the period specified in the contract. The peasants bowed to Roman and thanked him from the bottom of their hearts. The man happily shouted that they had heard that Roman was fighting for them. From now on they are willing to go all out if it comes to Roman. As expected, the Northeast Alliance turned tail. Roman smilingly replied that he had only done Dimitri's duty. Then he reflected that although they had planned to drag the central government into this, but the current central government had no choice but to dance to his tune. However, it is not for nothing that the alliance is called bats. If you close this issue now, then despite their humility, one day they will stab you in the back again. Roman, walking away from the happy crowd of peasants, thought that if the first stage is a provocation, then the second one is to face reality. We are taken to Roman, who is standing on the balcony and says to the crowd that, ladies and gentlemen, he has news for them that Dimitri is going to hold a sword tournament. The prize is 100 gold. People had different opinions about this. Some happily listened to his words, and some fearfully. Roman continued to say that for the sake of justice, he and Captain Jonathan would not participate. But this is not all. The participants will be divided into 6 groups. In total, they will choose 6 winners. He went on to say that as they already knew, he had participated in the war against the kingdom of Hector. He and his soldiers had already experienced how big the world was, and this experience had made them stronger. Romana leaned on the balcony, and then added that they would use the tournament to prove it to them, each of the 6 groups joining one of his soldiers if someone could take down his soldier and win. He will receive not only a prize, but also the opportunity to fulfill a wish. One of the peasants shouted that people from other families could also participate. Roman smilingly replied that if they confirmed that they were a swordsman of the northeastern lands, they wouldn't look at any other conditions. Then Roman, looking at the happy crowd, added that the tournament will be held in a month. Let them sum up properly. He hopes that many will take part. We are taken to the aristocrats who are discussing something. Viscount Conrad says that the sword tournament held by the family means that they have a great chance. Viscount Conrad crosses his arms and looks at the aristocrats with displeasure and says that if the Alliance swordsman wins, then they will have the right to make a wish as the winners. And then, if they don't seek out apologies, but behave like adults, sane people, offering to bury the hatchet and join forces, then they will be able to strengthen the damaged relationship with the Dimitri family and regain their lost dignity. But the question remains whether they can win. One of the aristocrats complains that without them, there will be many people who will be interested in the tournament. Whether they will be able to win by eliminating all the competitors, Viscount Conrad replies that this is true, and besides, aren't Chris and Kevin participating in a duel with Barco? If these guys take part in the tournament, it will not be easy to win. He answers that the tournament will be divided into 6 teams. Regardless of Chris and Kevin, they just need to select a winner for each group. If they mobilize all the forces of each family and put up an equal number of participants, then at least one of them will take the victory in their team. One of the nobles looked at Viscount Conrad and said that it made sense, while another said that at least one of them sounded like a good plan. Viscount Conrad now looked cautiously at the nobles and added, just to make everyone remember, the tournament was exactly 1 month away. If they couldn't use this chance granted by the heavens themselves, they would eventually be consumed by the power of the Dimitri family. They need to snatch victory by any means necessary, even if they have to expel a master from other lands of the Northeast man. We are taken to Roman, who is standing on a pedestal in front of his warriors, and he says that he is sure that they have already heard about the sword tournament. Roman, with his arms crossed, says that from now on they will fight each other for the next month to compare their skills, and he will select 6 warriors who will represent the Dimitri family at the tournament. Roman, looking at the task warriors and continuing to say that the last grade doesn't matter, only the grades received for this month indicate their current situation. Kevin wondered what the competition was. Roman, sternly looking at his fighters, thought that at least they had returned from the battlefield. Their war is not over yet, a force like a sharp blade that is ready to take its head off at any moment. So that subordinates strive for such power, you need to give them the appropriate reason over and over again. And then Roman said that besides, who will raise the prestige of the Dimitri family by representing it at the tournament, you need a worthy reward. Roman glanced at his fighters, who were listening intently, and then added that if any of the 6 selected swordsmen won, he would teach the winner a top-ranked technique. Whether it was spiritual practice or sword technique, it would help them rise to a higher level. The bald guy with tattoos on his face reflected that for him, a small part of the master's knowledge was able to ensure rapid progress. The novel is on a completely different level. Everyone listened carefully to Roman, and the bald guy continued to think that the chance to master a top-ranked technique was undoubtedly a huge stroke of luck. Roman, looking at his fighters, thought deeply that this tournament has two goals: to make the aristocracy of the northeastern region realize the reality and train his wards to perfect results. Romanu smiled, and then reflected that after the tournaments were over, the situation in the northeast would be very interesting. Then Roman added that from this moment on, endless competitions begin, and his fighters shouted in unison that they understood. We are transported to Roman, who is standing in the middle of the forest and holding onto his sword. He thought that there is exactly a month ahead. This is also the time to equip himself. Sky Demon Beak Junhyuk was born on the borderline between life and death, although he was used to danger, but it's rather stupid to bring trouble on himself. In this month, not only his subordinates, but also he himself should advance. Suddenly someone called out to Roman and asked if he had called him, and Roman turned around. In front of Roman was Lucas, dressed in the clothes of the head of the Information Guild. Roman said that he was going to go to closed training for a month. Lucas put his hand on his chest and said that he was listening. Romana then held out his sword and said that he would not accept any report unless there was some serious incident in the family. During this time, let Lucas take care of the sale of this sword. Lucas, looking at the sword puzzled, wondered what it was. Roman sternly replied while looking at the sword that he originally called it Firestorm, but since it would gain a new master, he decided to give it the name Flame. Lucas took the sword and looked at it in a puzzled way, and Roman continued to say that Lucas should decide for himself how to sell it. The main thing is not to reveal that the owner of this sword is Roman. He can put the money from the sale to the captain of the Information Guild. Lucas drew his sword from its scabbard and looked at it, the smooth blade shining with an aura. Lucas looked at it carefully, and then said that it was immediately obvious that the sword was somewhere to go. But why would Roman sell it? But it was not so important. He should first look for a place where it can be displayed. I thought that Roman said that he can decide for himself how to sell it. Maybe this is the best way to put up an anonymous planned auction. Lucas smiled, and then thought that even those who knew the price of the sword would definitely pay a round sum. We are transported to Adelian, the city of the northeastern region with the most developed trade, since the teleport gate is located on the territory. A man in a strict black suit lives at guest number 23. Lucas approaches him, wearing a brown cape covering his face and saying that it is him. The man takes out a small white crystal from his pocket and holds it up to the sword, then tells him to let him check the item first. The crystal starts to burn blue. The man looks at it in a puzzled way and then thinks that an extraordinary energy comes from the sword. Besides, the artifact is sewn with blue, which means that the product is of the highest class. The man takes off his glove and asks Lucas what kind of auction he prefers. Lucas says free bidding with complete anonymity of the seller. The man replied that there was no minimum sale amount at the free auction. Besides, he would have to pay a 10% commission whether he was sure. Lucas Echidna, smiling from under the hood, replied that he was sure. The man pointed in the direction of the passageway and then went there and said that they would go there for evaluation. A plump man appears in front of us with 2 rings on both hands, a monocle on his eye. This is the manager of the assembly hall, Morris. He laughs happily. And then it is said that he is Morris, the manager of the auction hall in Adeliana, and he is happy to meet you. Behind him sits a bald man who evaluates the sword, and then says that he can say with confidence that the durability and sharpness of the sword is at the highest level. He does not often meet such a good sword. And then he adds that besides, he has the most optimal weight. He assumes that the sword was forged by a master of his craft. Such goods should cost at least 30 gold. And now they will experience a resonance with mana. Resonance with mana is divided into 10 levels. You need to score at least 3 levels to get the title of a true named sword. The master, checking the resonance, was horrified. Blue stars shone around him and he shouted that this simply could not be. Morris turned to the master in a puzzled manner and asked what was the matter. The master replied that the resonance level had reached 10 levels, although no, the resonance is so high that it is impossible to calculate it. The masters looked at the puzzled and frightened Morris and shouted that even named swords break when they can take in the flow of mana, but this sword, on the contrary, only increases its power, and the puzzled Morris shouted that. Adeliana Auction Hall, a man standing on the stage waving his hands says that he strongly recommends that everyone present take part in this auction. In the entire history of the auction hall, nothing like this has ever appeared on its stage before. The man, speaking on stage, smiled maliciously and then thought that from local onlookers to the rich people of the capital, everyone was lured here by rumors. The man stretched out his arms to the pedestal, which was covered with a small cape, and shouted, "Let me introduce the main event of the evening." He pulled back the screen, then shouted, "Sword Flame." Aristocrats and ordinary onlookers watched the sword with admiration. The man continued to say that it would be an average named sword. It would not be put up as the main lot. The true power of the flame lies in the response of mana, if you remember about a year ago. A rapier named Needle with 7-level resonance went under the hammer for a staggering price of 300 gold. Let no one be surprised by the resonance with flame mana. The man shouted, which is more than 10 levels, but that's not all. The nobles listened carefully to the man and then started whispering as the man shouted that the sword was able to expand the power of the aura infused into it. The man looked at the hall with a smile and then said that he had seen a lot of named swords at auctions, but he had never met someone like Flame. The man held up a finger and shouted that they were coming to bid. The initial bid was 10 gold. The men were immediately flooded with bets. We did not have time to follow everyone in the beginning. He was offered 10 coins, then 30, and then he shouted that now each bet will increase by 50 gold. The man shouted that 100 gold was from number 39. One of the aristocrats looked at 39 with displeasure, and then raised the bid. The man shouted that 150 gold was from number 41. The fat aristocrat, smiling all over his teeth, raised number 12. The man shouted that the guest at number 12 was doubling the bid. His price soared to 300 gold. And then shouted that they are now raising the initial step by 100 gold. A man with red hair and sideburns appears in front of us. He is dressed in road clothes. He is smiling, but does nothing. A man performing on stage shouts that 400 minus 500 gold. 600 gold again from number 12. Aristocrats and ordinary people are watching in horror as the stakes go up and up. Number 53 rises. A man performing on stage, almost breaking his voice, shouts at the top of his voice that Lord number 53 is doubling the bet. The final bid is 1.200 gold. The fat aristocrat is madly angry and then breaks the sign with the number 12. The man performing on stage shouts that such prices have never been heard in the entire history of the Adelian auction hall. The head of a merchant guild operating across the continent, and the owner of untold wealth, although he always tries to remain neutral in the political feuds of the central government. But for the sake of a good thing, he turns into a fighting cock that rushes straight ahead, regardless of who his opponent is. We are taken to the VIP guest at the auction hall. Marquis Valentino is a man in rich clothes with a white shirt with disheveled orange hair and sideburns on his face. It was he who outbid the bet by betting 1.200 gold. At that moment, no one had any idea what kind of wave the entire Cairo kingdom would be affected by because of his purchase. A man performing on stage is smiling and shouting that guest number 53 is doubling the bid. The final bid has gone up to 1.200 gold. People are puzzled and turn to the guest at number 53 with admiration. The man performing on stage shouts that such a sum has never been heard in the entire history of the auction hall. Marquis Valentino smiles and reflects that the true value of the named flame sword is not only in the degree of resonance with mana. This is a symbol that for the first time someone managed to break through beyond the 10th level. Name and magic sword, a dilemma that every swordsman faces. Only by using simple weapons can you reach the peak of your ability and release your aura. But some swordsmen with mediocre abilities believe that a sword that enhances skills will be much more effective, and therefore choose a magic sword. But for swordsmen who have risen to the rank of ranker, only a named sword that can make the most of their aura is of value. Marquis Valentino, smiling maliciously, thought that such a thing would be worth all the treasures if the master who dug up this sword put it up for the second or third time. The flame's value couldn't help but rise, as this sword was sort of the first in history. The collection of a real master receives recognition of its rarity by the very first label alone. The aristocrats and common people stared at Marquis Valentino in bewilderment, a greedy collector with a passion for collecting. Marquis Valentino. If someone in these circles was unlucky enough to cross his path, one could say goodbye to life, so no one dared to act hastily. A man on the stage shouted that the sword was sold to guest number 53 for 1.200 gold. We are taken to Morris and Valentino. Morris asks what kind of payment he prefers. The Marquis Valentino replies that he will pay everything right on the spot, only so that he can see the flame at least a little earlier than Morris replies that he understood. A chest full of gold coins appears in front of Morris, and then Marquis Valentino says that to be more precise, there are 1,300 gold coins here. Morris, puzzled, replies that the amount to be paid is 1.200 gold pieces. Valentino, standing next to his servant, asks that since he didn't know about this, the gold pieces are a gift from him personally. Let them consider it a sincere gratitude of a regular customer. That's all. Morris happily replies that this is how it is. He thanks, but suddenly the Marquis Valentino says that in return, they will be able to tell him who forged this sword. He wants to meet him in person once. Morris, with his head down, fell into thought and then said that it would be difficult, and he asks for forgiveness. Marquis Valentino replies that it can't be helped then. Morris thanks and replies that thank you for coming into the situation. Marquis Valentino says no. It's an obvious choice from the auction position. Then the Marquis Valentino smiles and says that if this master sends the item to the market again, then let them inform him about it first. Morris replies that it is good. We are transported to the street, where the Marquis Valentino rides in a carriage and thinks that it is amazing, a real embodiment of art, smooth blades, and the ability to resonate with mana. Looking at the sword, Marquis Valentino smiles contentedly and thinks that he has acquired many named swords, but he has never met such a one, and then says that from now on they will throw all their efforts and resources into finding the creator of the Flash. Marquis Valentino sits across from the servant, and then says that considering that this is the first time his work has been auctioned at a dealian, first of all, let the head blacksmith Dimitri be checked. The servant replies that he listens and obeys. Marquis Valentino carefully examines the blade, strokes it and admires it. Marchioness Valentino's dreams were not something lofty. He was driven by a simple desire, that's all. During the month-long indoor training session, a lot had happened outside, with a sword flying at Chris from above. But he managed to trip up the attacker, and then one of the fighters fell to the ground. Chris turned to him and said that it was a reckless attack. Henderson turned around, gritting his teeth in anger. Henderson lost. Chris pointed the sword at Henderson and said that his efforts were commendable, but that the attack always lacks insight. Let them forget that the opponent is waiting for him to make the next move. Henderson replied that he will remember. Chris turned around and called out next, then realized that the ones who were worthy of taking one of the 6 spots were him and Kevin, Vulcan, and Fuki. Chris, looking at the fighting types, thought that there were 2 places left in question. Suddenly, he felt something. Chris looked up, puzzled. Looking up at the clear sky, he asked if the air was humming. We are transported to 2 weeks ago. Roman, furiously forging weapons, thought that when he met Butler for the first time, if he dared to fight to the end, he would be able to return alive. Roman thought back to the battle with Butler. The reason why he had won so far was because he had time to prepare for the attack. But if he didn't have that time, he wouldn't have been able to withstand the onslaught of the 5-star Aura warrior. Roman, furiously forging a weapon, thought that the presumptuous choice dictated by memories from his past life and his blunder, he still couldn't fully accept the fact that he was now Roman Dimitri. From the past, he had the confidence to win no matter who his enemy was, but from now on, he's not like that. In the future, there will be many battles waiting for him, and this may happen again. In order to survive in a battle with the strongest of this world, his current level will not be enough. Even if he meets an opponent who is superior to Butler, he must live without exchanging doubts. This is what is called the top. While the sun rose and set, Roman tirelessly continued to work on the iron, standing in front of the flame of the brazier. His face was red hot from the heat, and his bare skin was beginning to melt. Roman's body was endlessly sending out signals that had already reached the limit, but there was no hesitation in his eyes. He swung fiercely for another iron strike. Everything must be reborn, and it has one that will accept it as the host. Roman used the fire-breathing technique. He inhaled the flame, absorbing the mana inside it. Effectively acting as a conduit between the sword and the flame, Roman's body rushed towards the ideal. The second perestroika of bones, Roman once again entered the path of change. We are transported to the present time. The novel came out of a blacksmith's forge, from which black steam emanated. Roman's body was perfect. He reflected that he had laid the foundation for reaching a new level. Roman closed his eyes and then took a deep breath. And then he thought that he should take the risk, and Battler appeared in Roman's mind. He went around it from different sides. Then Roman thought that now he will fight 2 battlers at the same time. The 2 battlers jumped up. They launched an attack from above on Roman. Roman pondered that the Sky Demon sword was divided into 3 levels. 3 styles on the first, 3 on the second, and 3 on the third. 2 butlers swung at Roman for a punch. Roman had a sword in his hand and was thinking that up until now, he could only use it in the first level style. Roman Lovka deflected 2 of Butler's punches, almost simultaneously. He thought that now, after 2 bone rearrangements, everything has changed. If he survives the 3rd bone rearrangement, he will be able to use the 3 styles of the last one. Roman swung back to strike, then reflected that he was promising himself that there would be no opponents left to stop him. With the title of Undefeated Master, which in the past was called the Heavenly Demon Beak Junhyuk, Roman sliced through the first battler with a deft movement, and then thought that now that he had access to 2nd level style, he could beat 2 battlers. But isn't he making a mistake by continuing to use methods and asking for life as it is? Roman thought back to Battler using his aura, and he thought that controlling the aura that the swordsmen of this world release like an explosion can sometimes be extremely powerful, surpassing even the nagging that existed in Murim. The 2 battlers took a swing at Roman. He thought that depending on the situation and the enemy, he needed to learn the methods of this world. Roman smiled madly. His eyes were burning with a violet flame. He thought that he needed to break the stereotype in his head that the technique of controlling the aura in this life is fundamentally wrong, and find a middle ground between this life and the past. Roman released a huge energy, white and black in different directions, 3-second level styles. There was a huge purple explosion, destroying everything in its path, in the center of which stood Roman. Roman cut 2 battlers with one blow. He just stood there and stared ahead. Suddenly, blood splattered on the floor.